They sat me at the kids' table at 36 years old, while my brother, who'd bankrupted 3 businesses, got a standing ovation for finally landing a real job. My mother looked at me across that holiday dinner and said the words I'll never forget. Maybe next year. Just send a card. You don't fit in anymore. Everyone laughed. My brother smirked. My father said nothing. They had no idea that earlier that week I'd closed on a $7 million mountain estate. The same land my grandmother once owned, the one they told me she'd left to my brother. The one I just discovered was actually meant for me. But I didn't say a word. I smiled, nodded, and left. I spent Christmas alone in my sanctuary, posted 1 photo, no caption, no location. By morning, 10 million views, 98 missed calls, all from the family who erased me from every photo, every memory, every moment that mattered. They wanted back in. They wanted explanations, money, access. But here's what they didn't know: I'd been keeping a secret for 15 years. And I was about to burn their world down with nothing but the truth. Stay with me. Because what happened next? They never saw it coming. My name is Julia Lane. I'm 36 years old, and for the past 15 years I've built a career in financial advising that put me on the Forbes list of top 50 women in finance under 40. I manage over $12 million in client assets, own a penthouse in Manhattan, and wake up every morning to a view that makes visitors stop mid-sentence. But none of that seemed to matter when I pulled into my childhood driveway that December 23rd, carrying a bottle of expensive wine I knew no one would appreciate, and wearing a smile I'd practiced in the rearview mirror. The house looked exactly the same. Red brick, white trim, the wreath on the door that my mother replaced every year with military precision. I could hear voices inside, laughter spilling out through the windows like warm light. For just a moment, standing there on the porch with my hand on the doorknob, I let myself hope that this year would be different. It wasn't. I walked into a scene I'd seen 100 times before. The dining room table was set for 8, my mother's good china gleaming under the chandelier. My brother Brian stood at the head of the table, gesturing broadly as he told some story that had everyone leaning in captivated. His wife sat beside him, nodding along like he was delivering the Gettysburg Address. My father occupied his usual spot, pipe in hand, chuckling at all the right moments. There was no chair for me at that table. "Oh, Julia!" My mother appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're here. We didn't think you'd make it with your busy schedule and all." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Why don't you sit over there, dear?" She gestured vaguely toward the corner where a small folding table had been set up. The kids' table. 2 of my nephews were already there, arguing over a handheld video game. I was 36 years old. "Of course, I said, keeping my voice light. "No problem at all." Dinner was an exercise in restraint. I sat at my little table in the corner, cutting my turkey into neat pieces, while Brian's voice carried across the room. He was talking about his new job, the 3rd one this year. Everyone applauded when he announced he'd made it through his probationary period. My mother actually stood up and hugged him. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've worked so hard to get here." My father raised his glass. "To Brian, finally hitting his stride." No one looked my way. Not when I quietly refilled my own wine glass. Not when I got up to clear my plate. It was as if I were a ghost moving through a house that had already forgotten I existed. Later, while helping in the kitchen, I passed through the hallway and stopped. The family photo wall had been updated. New frames, new memories. There was Brian's college graduation, Brian's wedding, Brian with his kids at Disney World. I scanned the wall looking for myself. I found one photo from my own college graduation, tucked in the corner, slightly faded, and one from when I was 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning beside my grandmother. Everything recent I'd been cropped out, carefully edited from the edges of group shots replaced with potted plants or strategic framing, as if I'd never been there at all. I heard my mother's voice from the living room talking to one of her friends who'd stopped us by with cookies. "Julia, oh, she's still figuring things out, you know. Career women, they're never quite satisfied, are they? Always chasing something." I stood in that hallway, staring at those photographs, and felt something inside me go very still and very quiet. When I left that night, my mother walked me to the door. She didn't hug me. She stood there with her arms crossed, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pity, maybe, or irritation. "Julia," she said, her voice flat and cold. "Next year. Maybe just send a card. You don't fit in anymore." I heard my brother laugh from somewhere inside the house. The sound followed me all the way to my car. I sat there for a moment in the darkness, keys in my hand, staring at the steering wheel. Then I turned the ignition and drove. By the time I hit the highway, I was crying. Not the gentle, controlled tears I'd learned to produce in therapy sessions. These were the ugly, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal, the kind that made my chest hurt and my hands shake on the wheel. I had to pull over at a rest stop 20 miles outside the city, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to remember how to breathe. This was who I'd become. A woman so skilled at swallowing pain that when it finally erupted, it felt like drowning. I made it back to my penthouse just after midnight. The doorman wished me Merry Christmas. I smiled and thanked him, my voice perfectly steady, my face perfectly composed. That's what 15 years of practice will do. You learn to build walls so high that even you forget what you've locked inside them. My therapist once told me something I've never been able to forget. It was during our last session, 3 months ago, right before I told her I didn't need to come back anymore. She'd looked at me across her tasteful office with those kind, knowing eyes and said, "Julia, you don't need me to fix you. You're not broken, but you need permission to be human. And I can't give you that. Only you can." I'd written her a check and never went back. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Manhattan. From up here, the city looked like a jewellery box, all glittering lights and careful arrangement. Beautiful and cold. Just like me, I suppose. Just like the life I'd built. The memories came anyway, the way they always did, when I let my guard down. I was 21 again, standing in the funeral home, staring at my grandmother's casket. She'd been the only person who'd ever looked at me and seen something worth celebrating. When I graduated high school as valedictorian, she threw me a party. When I got into college, she cried happy tears and told me I was going to change the world. When everyone else compared me unfavourably to Brian, she would pull me aside and whisper, "You're my strongest pine, Julia. Don't let them make you small." She'd given me a golden pine cone ornament when I was 8 years old. I still had it tucked away in my jewellery box. It was the only thing of hers I thought that I owned. At the funeral, I'd stood there in my black dress, grief sitting in my chest like a stone, and my mother had pulled me aside. Her face was carefully neutral, the way it always was, when she delivered bad news she didn't want to be blamed for. "Your grandmother's will has been read," she said. "She left everything to Brian. The house, the money, all of it. There's nothing for you, Julia." I remember the way the floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Nothing. She knew Brian needed help getting started. "You've always been self-sufficient." My mother's voice was brisk, dismissive. "Don't make a scene. This is hard enough on all of us." I didn't make a scene. I never did. I stood there and nodded and felt something inside me crack so quietly that no one else heard it break. For 15 years, I'd carried that knowledge like a scar. My grandmother, the one person I thought loved me unconditionally, had chosen Brian too, just like everyone else. I must have been wrong about those whispered encouragements, those proud smiles. Maybe I'd imagined the warmth in her eyes when she looked at me. Maybe I'd been fooling myself all along. So I'd done what I always did. I worked harder. Longer hours, bigger accounts, more impressive credentials. I climbed and climbed until I reached the top, thinking that if I could just achieve enough, accomplish enough, prove enough, maybe someone would finally see me the way I'd thought my grandmother had. But the higher I climbed, the more invisible I became to the people whose approval I'd spent my whole life chasing. My $12 million portfolio was still figuring things out. My Forbes recognition was nice, but when are you going to settle down? My penthouse was lonely, don't you think? I'd built an empire trying to earn love from people who'd decided long ago that I wasn't worth loving. I was standing there, lost in these thoughts, when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. It was nearly 1 a.m. on Christmas Eve. But something made me look. An email. The sender was a law firm I didn't recognise, Henderson White & Associates, estate planning and trust law. The subject line made my wine glass pause halfway to my lips. R.E. Lane Family Trust. Urgent discrepancies found. My heart started beating faster. I set down the glass and opened the email with shaking hands. Ms. Lane, my name is Robert Henderson. I'm contacting you regarding your late grandmother, Margaret Eleanor Lane's estate. Our firm recently discovered documents related to a family trust established in your name. There are serious irregularities that require immediate attention. This concerns your inheritance. Please call my office first thing tomorrow morning. Time is of the essence. I read it 3 times. Then I read it again. My grandmother's name stared back at me from the screen. Trust established in my name. Irregularities. Inheritance. The words didn't make sense. My mother had been clear. There was nothing for me. She'd left everything to Brian, unless she'd been lying. I stood there in my silent penthouse Manhattan, glittering below me, and felt the ground shift beneath my feet for the second time in 15 years. This time, though, I wasn't standing in a funeral home swallowing my grief to keep the peace. This time, I was going to find out the truth. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch until dawn broke over the city, reading and rereading that email until the words blurred together. When the clock hit 8 a.m, I called the number at the bottom of the message. A receptionist answered on the second ring, and hearing the urgency in my voice put me through immediately. Ms. Lane, Robert Henderson said. His voice was warm but professional, the kind that had delivered both good news and devastating news many times before. Thank you for calling so quickly. Can you come to my office today? This isn't a conversation we should have over the phone. I was in his office by 10. The building was in Midtown, one of those old establishments with dark wood panelling and leather chairs that smelled like money and discretion. Henderson himself was probably 60, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He stood when I entered, shook my hand and gestured to a chair across from his massive desk. I'll get right to it, he said, opening a file folder that looked thick enough to contain a novel. Your grandmother, Margaret Eleanor Lane, established a trust fund in your name in 2009. You would have been 21 at the time. My throat went dry. A trust fund? Yes, $2.8 million to be held in trust until you reach the age of 30. At that point, the funds would be released to you directly. He looked at me over his glasses. You turned 36 years ago, Ms. Lane, in 2019. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. $2.8 million, held for me, waiting for me. Your brother Brian was named as trustee, Henderson continued. His role was purely administrative, manage the investments, ensure the funds grew conservatively, and transfer everything to you when you reached the specified age. It's a common arrangement when the beneficiary is young and the grantor wants to ensure financial maturity before releasing substantial assets. Brian, I whispered. Brian was in charge of it. Henderson's expression darkened. Yes, and that's where our problem begins. He pulled out another document, this one covered in numbers and dates. Ms. Lane, your brother never told you about this trust, did he? I shook my head, not trusting my voice. We discovered irregularities during a routine bank audit last month. The trust account that should have contained approximately $3.5 million after 15 years of growth is empty, completely depleted. We began investigating and found a pattern of unauthorized withdrawals. beginning in 2015. The room seemed to tilt. Unauthorized. Your brother had limited authority to access the funds for specific administrative purposes. He exceeded that authority significantly. Henderson pulled out more papers and I saw transaction records, casino receipts, business loan documents. Between 2015 and 2019, he systematically embezzled the entire trust. Gambling losses, failed business ventures, personal expenses. By 2020, there was nothing left. I stared at those papers at the evidence of my brother's theft and felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. That's 5 years ago. Isn't there a statute of limitations on this kind of thing? Normally, yes, but here's the critical detail. Henderson leaned forward. Your brother didn't stop in 2020. Over the past 4 years, he's taken out multiple loans using the trust as collateral, even though the trust was empty. He forged documents, created false statements, showing assets that didn't exist. The most recent fraudulent loan was taken out this year, just 6 months ago. That means the statute of limitations hasn't expired. The fraud is ongoing. I thought about Brian at that dinner table 2 nights ago, accepting congratulations for keeping a job for 3 months. I thought about my mother's pride in his face. I thought about myself sitting at the kids' table, invisible and dismissed. My mother, I said slowly. Did she know? Henderson's silence was answer enough. Then he slid one more document across the desk. An email printed out dated 2010, from my mother to Brian. The subject line read, "Re Julia's Trust Fund." I read it with shaking hands. "Brian, we agreed you would handle this quietly. Julia doesn't need to know. She's always been self-sufficient. You need the help more than she does. Just be careful. Make it last." The words swam in front of my eyes. Make it last. As if my inheritance was a pie they'd decided to slice up for themselves. As if my grandmother's love was a resource to be redistributed to the child they'd already chosen as worthy. "Ms. Lane?" Henderson's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" I wasn't. I was 21 years old again, standing at my grandmother's funeral, hearing my mother tell me I'd been forgotten. Feeling that crack spread through my chest, that fundamental breaking of something I'd thought was unbreakable. I'd spent 15 years building walls to protect myself from that pain. 15 years working myself to exhaustion, trying to prove I was worth loving. 15 years believing the one person who'd ever truly seen me had chosen someone else in the end. "She didn't forget me," I said out loud. The words came out broken, barely more than a whisper. "My grandmother, she didn't forget me." "No, Ms. Lane," Henderson said gently. "She very much remembered you. According to her will, you were her primary beneficiary. The trust documents include a personal letter she wrote to be given to you when you turned 30. Your brother never delivered it. We found it in the file. Would you like to read it?" He held out an envelope yellowed with age, my name written on it, in my grandmother's familiar handwriting. I took it with trembling fingers but couldn't open it. Not yet. Not here. When I got home, I went straight to my jewellery box and pulled out the golden pine cone ornament my grandmother had given me when I was 8 years old. I held it in my palm, feeling its weight, remembering her voice. "You're my strongest pine, Julia." They made me believe she forgot me, I said to my empty penthouse, tears streaming down my face. She never did. I sat there for 3 days with my grandmother's letter, reading it over and over until I could recite every word from memory. She'd written it the month before she died, her handwriting shakier than I remembered, but still distinctly hers. She told me she was proud of the woman I was becoming. She told me the money was meant to give me freedom, not obligation. She told me she knew I'd do something meaningful with it, something that would make the world a little bit better. And at the end, she'd written, "You're my strongest pine, my darling girl, grow deep roots and weather every storm." Robert Henderson called twice during those 3 days, asking what I wanted to do about pressing charges. I told him I needed time to think. What I didn't tell him was that I wasn't thinking about courtrooms or police reports or the satisfaction of watching my brother and mother face legal consequences. I was thinking about something else entirely. Revenge is what you do when you're angry. I wasn't angry. I was clear. Maybe for the first time in my entire adult life, I could see exactly what I needed to do, and it had nothing to do with punishing the people who'd hurt me. It had everything to do with honouring the person who'd loved me. I wanted to act on my own terms, not out of rage or pain or the desperate need to make them see what they'd done. I wanted to build something, to reclaim something, to take back what had been stolen not through lawsuits and accusations, but through the quiet, deliberate construction of a life they could never touch. So I started searching. 15 years of financial advising had taught me how to research, how to evaluate investments, how to see potential where others saw only numbers on a page. I'd saved $7 million through careful planning and disciplined saving, living well below my means despite the penthouse and the designer suits. Money, I'd always thought I was accumulating to prove something to people who would never care. Now I understood it had been waiting for exactly this moment. I spent my evenings scrolling through real estate listings in Colorado. Mountain properties, estates land, with history. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for until I found it on the fourth night of searching. The listing was simple, almost understated Silver Pine estate. 40 acres, original 1920s lodge, recently renovated floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Rockies' complete privacy. But it was the location that made my breath catch. The exact coordinates, where my grandmother's family had owned land for 3 generations. The property she'd told me stories about when I was a child. The place where she'd spent summers as a girl, where she had learned to love the silence of mountains and the strength of pine trees that bent in storms but never broke. My family had sold it in 2012. Brian needed capital for another business venture, and my mother had convinced my father it was the practical thing to do. No one was using it anymore, she'd said. No point in sentimentality. Now it was on the market again. $7 million. I called the listing agent before I could talk myself out of it. Her name was Patricia, and she had that warm, capable voice of someone who'd been selling mountain properties for decades. Yes, the estate was still available. Yes, she could show it to me. How soon could I get to Colorado? I was on a plane the next morning. The estate was everything the photos had promised, and more. The main lodge sat on a rise overlooking a valley of pine trees that stretched as far as I could see. The renovation had been done with care, preserving the original timber and stone while adding modern comforts. There was a massive fireplace in the great room, a kitchen with windows that framed the mountains like living paintings, bedrooms with views that made you want to wake up early just to watch the sunrise. But it was the land itself that sold me. I walked the property line, breathing in air so clean it almost hurt, and felt something settle in my chest that had been restless for as long as I could remember. This was the ground my grandmother had walked. These were the trees she'd known. This was the legacy she'd wanted me to have, not in money, but in roots, in place, in belonging. "I'll take it," I told Patricia. She blinked. "Don't you want to think about it? Sleep on it. Most people at least want to see the inspection reports before they make an offer." "I'm sure," I said. "Draw up the paperwork. I can close as soon as the process allows." What followed were 3 weeks of the kind of tedious but necessary work I knew well from my career. Inspections revealed minor issues, nothing that couldn't be fixed. The title search came back clean. I arranged the wire transfer, reviewed stacks of documents, signed my name so many times my hand cramped. Patricia seemed bemused by my efficiency, but I'd spent 15 years managing other people's financial decisions. Handling my own was almost relaxing by comparison. I told no one. Not my colleagues, not the few friends I'd maintained over the years. Certainly not my family. I returned to New York and went about my normal routine as if nothing had changed. I showed up to client meetings, reviewed portfolios, sent my mother a polite text, declining her half-hearted invitation to Sunday dinner. She didn't push. She never did. At night, I sat in my penthouse and imagined next Christmas. Not at a kid's table in a house where I didn't belong, but in my own space surrounded by silence and pine trees, and the knowledge that I'd built something my grandmother would have been proud of. For the first time in 36 years, I would spend Christmas exactly as I wanted. Alone. At peace. Free. My phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks to the day after I'd made my offer. I saw Patricia's number and answered immediately. "Congratulations, Ms. Lane," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Silver Pine is yours." I drove back to Colorado 3 days later with 2 suitcases and a plan. The closing took less than an hour. I sat in a title company office that smelled like coffee and old paper, signed the final documents, and accepted the keys from Patricia, who squeezed my hand and said, "I hope this place brings you everything you're looking for." It already had. The first thing I did was hire a local decorator. Her name was Susan, and she understood immediately what I wanted when I said the words peaceful and simple and home. Within a week, she'd transformed the space. Soft throws on the leather couches, cream-coloured pillows that caught the afternoon light, evergreen wreaths that made the whole lodge smell like Christmas, even though it was late January. She brought in candles that flickered in the evening, and a sound system that let me play music so quietly it felt like the house itself was humming. I spent my first real night there alone, exactly as I'd imagined. I'd taken a month off work, something I hadn't done in 15 years. My clients understood. My colleagues were surprised, but supportive. No one asked questions I didn't want to answer. That evening, I made myself dinner in the enormous kitchen, watching the sun set over the mountains through those floor-to-ceiling windows. The sky turned purple and gold, and finally deep blue, and the stars came out like diamonds on velvet. I'd never seen so many stars in my life. In New York, the city lights washed them all away. Here, they were endless. I took a photo. Just one. The view from my window, the pine trees dark against the twilight, a single candle reflected in the glass. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. I opened Instagram, posted it with the simplest caption I could think of. Peace has a view. No location tag, no hashtags, no explanation. Just those 4 words and an image that felt like the first honest thing I'd shared with the world in longer than I could remember. Then, I put my phone down and didn't think about it again. I spent the rest of that evening exactly as I dreamed. I built a fire in the massive stone fireplace, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat on the couch with my grandmother's letter in one hand and her golden pine cone ornament in the other. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like the ocean. I felt something I hadn't felt in so long, I'd almost forgotten what to call it. Peace. Real, deep, unshakable peace. I fell asleep on that couch, wrapped in a cashmere throw, with the firelight warm on my face. I didn't dream. I didn't need to. When I woke the next morning, I made coffee and watched the sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold. I took a long shower in the master bathroom with its views of the valley. I put on comfortable clothes and thick socks and wandered through my house, touching things, claiming space, feeling what it was like to exist somewhere I didn't have to perform or prove or pretend. It wasn't until late afternoon that I remembered my phone. I'd left it in my purse, deliberately wanting at least 24 hours of complete disconnection. When I finally pulled it out, the screen was black. Dead battery. I plugged it in and went to make myself lunch. 10 minutes later, it powered on. And then it started buzzing, and buzzing, and buzzing. Notification after notification flooded the screen so fast I couldn't read them. Instagram alerts, text messages, missed calls, voicemails. The phone actually felt hot in my hand from the sheer volume of activity. I stared at it, confused, my heart starting to race with an anxiety I didn't understand yet. I opened Instagram first. My photo had 40,000 likes. 40,000. I had 300 followers, mostly colleagues, and a handful of acquaintances. I'd never gotten more than 20 likes on anything I'd posted. But this image had been shared and reshared, and the comments section had exploded into thousands of messages from strangers. Then I saw it. A repost from someone named Alexandra Chen. The account had 2 million followers. Her caption read, "Most serene winter retreat I've ever seen. This is what peace looks like. Does anyone know where this is?" The post had 10 million views. 10 million people had seen my sanctuary, my private moment, my quiet reclamation of something sacred. I scrolled through the comments with shaking hands. People were trying to identify the location from the pine trees, the mountains, the architectural style. Some thought it was Switzerland. Others guessed Canada or Montana. A few were getting close with Colorado, but no one knew exactly where. Not yet. Then I looked at my missed calls. 98 of them. I felt my blood run cold as I recognized the numbers. My mother, Brian, Brian's wife, my father, my mother again, Brian again. Over and over and over, starting from this morning and continuing every few minutes throughout the day. Not one of these people had called me in months. Some of them hadn't called me in years. But now, my phone was full of their desperate attempts to reach me. I scrolled to my text messages and my stomach dropped. 23 texts from my mother. The first ones were casual, asking if I'd seen that viral post that looked like my style. Then they became more insistent, then accusatory, then finally sent just an hour ago the words that made my hands start to shake. "We know it's you. We're coming to Colorado. Expect us tomorrow." I stood there in my beautiful kitchen, holding my phone, staring at those words, and realised something with perfect, crystalline clarity. They'd ignored me for 36 years, but the moment they thought I had something worth taking, they couldn't get to me fast enough. I had one day to prepare myself. One day to decide how I would handle the inevitable confrontation, what version of myself I would present when they walked through my door, demanding explanations I didn't owe them. I considered not being there when they arrived. I could drive into town, spend the day at a coffee shop, let them knock on an empty door and realise I didn't have to make myself available just because they'd decided to show up. But that felt like running. And I was done running. So I stayed. I made coffee in my beautiful kitchen, lit a fire in the great room, and settled onto the couch with a book I had no intention of reading. I was simply waiting, calm and centred in a way I'd never been before when facing my family. This was my house, my space, my rules. They were entering my territory now, not the other way around. The rental car pulled up at exactly 11 in the morning. I watched from the window as 3 doors opened. My mother emerged first, wearing her good winter coat and the expression she reserved for church and difficult conversations. Brian came next, looking around with that assessing gaze he used when calculating the value of things. His wife, Amanda, followed last, her face pinched with cold, and what I suspected was reluctance. I didn't go to the door. I waited for them to knock. When they did, I counted to 10 before answering. Small acts of control, reminding myself that I could set the pace of this encounter. My mother's face when I opened the door was a masterclass in manufactured emotion. Surprise, hurt, confusion, all arranged in precisely the right proportions to make me feel guilty for her discomfort. "Julia," she said, her voice trembling just slightly, "we've been trying to reach you for 2 days. Why didn't you answer your phone? Not hello, not how are you? Just immediate accusation wrapped in concern. I turned it off," I said simply. "I came here for peace and quiet." "Well, you can't just disappear like that," Brian said, pushing past me into the house without waiting for an invitation. "We were worried sick. We had to hire someone to find you." I closed the door slowly, watching them spread through my space like they owned it. Brian was already examining the vaulted ceilings, the custom woodwork, the designer furniture. Amanda hovered near the entrance, looking uncomfortable. My mother stood in the centre of the great room, turning in a slow circle as she took in the floor-to-ceiling windows, the mountain views, the fireplace that could fit 3 people standing inside it. "You hired someone?" I asked, my voice deliberately mild. "A private investigator," my mother said, as if this were perfectly reasonable. "He found the property records. Julia Lane, Silver Pine Estate, closed 2 weeks ago. Why didn't you tell us?" There it was, the signature move. Make it about my failure to inform them, as if I owed them a detailed accounting of my life decisions. "We're family," Brian added, his voice taking on that wounded tone he'd perfected over the years. "You don't just buy a $7 million house and not tell your family. That's not how this works." I walked to the kitchen and poured myself more coffee, taking my time. When I returned, they were all staring at me, waiting for an apology or an explanation or some acknowledgement that I'd done something wrong. "How family works," I said carefully, "is that you show up for each other. You include each other. You see each other. You don't get to ignore someone for years and then demand transparency the moment it's convenient for you." Brian laughed. Actually laughed. "Come on, Julia, don't be dramatic. You're not exactly easy to include. You're always working, always busy, always off in your own world." He gestured around the room with something like contempt. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You probably rented this place for the weekend to take Instagram photos. All show, no substance. That's always been your problem." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Not the words themselves, but the ease with which he dismissed everything I'd built, everything I'd and everything I was. I set down my coffee cup and walked to the study off the great room. I pulled open the top drawer of the desk and retrieved the folder I'd placed there yesterday, knowing I might need it. When I returned, I handed it to Brian without a word. He opened it frowning. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. I watched his face change as he realised what he was holding. "Property deed," I said quietly. "Dated 2 weeks ago. Sole owner Julia Margaret Lane. Purchase price $7 million. Paid in full with funds from my personal savings account accumulated over 15 years of financial advising work." Brian's face had gone pale, gone. Amanda leaned over to look at the documents, her eyes widening. My mother snatched the folder from Brian's hands and read it herself, her lips moving slightly as she processed each line. "I bought it," I continued, my voice steady and clear. "With money I earned, every single penny. I didn't rent it, I didn't finance it, I didn't get help from anyone. This house is mine." The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the fire crackling, the wind moving through the pines outside my own heartbeat, steady and strong. My mother looked up from the papers and I watched her eyes change. The manufactured hurt disappeared, replaced by something harder and more calculating. She glanced around the room again, but this time she was adding up values, estimating worth, determining what she thought she could claim. When she spoke, her voice had lost all pretense of maternal concern. "Then, you owe us," she said flatly. "We sacrificed everything raising you. Everything. And now you have all this, and you couldn't even tell us. You couldn't even think to share. I should have asked them to leave right then. Should have opened the door and watched them drive away down my mountain, out of my sanctuary, out of my life. But some part of me, the part that had spent 36 years trying to understand why I was never enough, needed to hear what came next, needed to see exactly how far they would go. "Stay for dinner," I heard myself say. My mother blinked, surprised. Brian exchanged a glance with Amanda, and I could see him recalculating, thinking he'd found an opening, a weakness he could exploit. "Of course we'll stay, 'cause..." My mother said, her voice warming immediately. "That's what family does." I made pasta. Nothing fancy, just something to keep my hands busy while they settled into my space like they belonged there. Brian helped himself to my wine without asking. My mother rearranged the place settings I'd laid out, putting herself at the head of the table as if this were her house, her table, her right. Amanda sat quietly, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. We ate in a silence that felt like the air before a thunderstorm. Heavy, waiting. I could feel my mother building up to something, choosing her words carefully, and I was content to let her. I'd learned patience over the years. Sometimes the best strategy was simply to wait and let people reveal themselves. She cleared her throat delicately. Julia, I've been thinking. This house is enormous, far too big for one person, and you're always talking about how busy you are with work. It seems like such a waste for it to sit empty most of the time. I'm not sure where you're going with this, I said, though I knew exactly where she was going. I'm saying it would make sense to share this space with family. Brian and Amanda could use a vacation home, somewhere for the kids to visit. It would be good for all of us. She smiled that smile I'd seen 1,000 times, the one that said she was being reasonable, and anyone who disagreed was being difficult. It's a moral obligation, really. When you have abundance, you share it with the people who helped you get there. Brian nodded, warming to the theme. Exactly. I mean, we helped you grow up, Julia. Fed you, clothed, you gave you a roof over your head for 18 years. That's worth something, isn't it? This is payback time. This is how family works. I picked up my wine glass and took a slow sip, feeling the weight of it in my hand, the coolness of the crystal against my palm. Then I set it down very deliberately, the base touching the table with a soft click that seemed louder than it was. You want to discuss debts? I asked quietly. Something in my tone made Brian stop mid-reach for the breadbasket. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. I stood up and walked to the sideboard where I'd placed a leather portfolio earlier that day. I'd known somehow that I would need it. I carried it back to the table and opened it in front of them, pulling out the first set of documents. 2012, I said, laying the papers on the table. I was 23 years old, working my first real job in financial advising. I got a call from a collections agency saying I was 3 months behind on a business loan, $180,000. I was confused because I'd never taken out a business loan. I pulled out the next page, the loan application with my forged signature. But there was my name, my social security number, my credit score, which was excellent at the time. Someone had used my identity as a guarantor for a loan to capitalize a tech startup that folded within 6 months. Brian's face had gone very still. Amanda was staring at the documents with growing horror. I spent 5 years paying off that loan. I continued, my voice steady and clear. 5 years of living in a studio apartment, taking the subway instead of cabs, eating ramen for dinner, putting every spare dollar toward debt I never incurred. For your business failures, Brian. Your startup, your gambling problem when the business went south. Your mess that you made with my name. Julia, my mother started, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished, because here's the interesting part. I pulled out more documents, these ones recent printed out just yesterday from the credit monitoring service I'd signed up for after my meeting with Robert Henderson. 2022, another loan, $50,000. Tech equipment for another failed venture. My name again. 2023. 75,000. Home equity line of credit on a house you don't even own anymore. And my personal favourite from 6 months ago. A loan against grandmother's trust fund. The trust fund that was empty because you'd already stolen everything from it. But you forged a document saying it still had assets and you borrowed against it. That's fraud on top of fraud, Brian. That's $125,000 in loans taken out in my name in just the last 2 years. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the fire crackling in the other room, the wind against the windows, my own heartbeat steady and strong. Brian's face had gone from red to white to a sickly grey colour. His mouth opened but no sound came out. Amanda pushed back from the table slightly, as if physically distancing herself from what she was hearing. My mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. That was for the family, she said, her voice shaking with something that might have been rage or fear or both. Everything Brian did, he did to keep this family afloat. Stop being so selfish and dramatic. The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I watched my mother's face flushed with righteous anger. and saw what I'd been looking at my entire life without fully understanding it. She actually believed what she was saying. In her mind, Brian's theft was justified, my pain was exaggeration, and I was the problem for refusing to accept the role they'd assigned me. She reached for me, then her hand trembling as she gripped my arm. Her eyes filled with tears, perfectly timed, perfectly calibrated. "Julia, please, after everything we did for you, how can you be so cold and ungrateful? We gave you a home, an education, a family. We loved you. And this is how you repay us, by throwing our mistakes in our faces, by refusing to help your own brother when he's struggling." It was a masterclass in manipulation. The trembling voice, the tears that didn't quite fall, the way she positioned herself as the victim of my cruelty rather than the architect of my pain. A younger version of myself would have crumbled under the weight of it, would have apologized, explained, tried desperately to make her understand why I was hurt, why this mattered, why I deserved better. But I wasn't that version of myself anymore. I stood up slowly, pulling my arm free from her grasp. I looked directly at her, meeting her eyes with a steadiness I'd spent 15 years learning to summon. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, but absolutely clear. "You want explanations?" I asked. "You want me to justify why I won't hand over my money, my home, my peace to people who've spent 36 years treating me like I don't matter? I spent 36 years explaining why I deserved love, why I deserved a seat at the table, why I deserved to be included in family photos, why I deserved honesty instead of theft. I'm done." My mother's mouth opened, but I kept speaking. "I'm done explaining. I'm done justifying. I'm done making myself smaller so you can feel bigger. I'm done pretending that what you did to me was normal or acceptable or somehow my fault for being too sensitive." Brian started to say something, but I held up my hand. "No, you don't get to speak right now. You've said enough. You've taken enough. This conversation is over." I walked to the entryway and opened the front door. Cold air rushed in sharp and clean. "It's time for you to leave." The silence that followed was profound. I could see the calculation happening on my mother's face, the rapid assessment of whether tears or anger or pleading would work better. Brian looked at Amanda as if expecting her to intervene, but she was staring at her plate, her face pale. None of them moved. "Now," I said. They left, slowly gathering their coats with stiff, offended movements, but they left. My mother paused at the door, opening her mouth one more time, but something in my expression stopped her. I closed the door behind them and locked it, listening to their car start watching through the window as the taillights disappeared down the mountain road. Only then did I let myself breathe. "Aunt Jules." I turned to find Eli standing in the doorway to the guest room, where I'd asked him to stay during dinner. He was 10 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that always seemed to need cutting, and eyes that saw far too much for a child who'd lost his mother just over a year ago. I'd been his mother's best friend since college, and when she died in that car accident, becoming his guardian had been the easiest decision I'd ever made. Adopting him legally had taken months of paperwork and court appearances, but he'd been mine from the moment I picked him up from the hospital, where they told him she was gone. I'd kept him secret from my family. Partially because the adoption was still being finalised, but mostly because I knew exactly what they would say, that I was taking on too much, that I wasn't equipped to be a mother, that I was being impulsive. I couldn't bear to hear their judgment about the one purely good thing I'd ever done. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, crouching down to his level. "I'm sorry you had to hear all that." I didn't hear much, just the last part. He came closer, studying my face with that serious expression he wore when he was worried. "Are you okay?" "I am," I said, and realised it was true. "Don't you want them to understand?" he asked. "Why you're upset, I mean. Don't you want them to know they hurt you?" It was such an innocent question asked with the genuine confusion of a child who still believed that understanding led to change, that explanation led to apology, that truth could fix broken things. I pulled him into a hush hug, resting my chin on top of his head. Understanding is a gift, I said softly. It's something we give to people who've earned it. People who have shown us they care about our feelings, who've proven they want to do better, who've made an effort to see us clearly. Your mum understood that. She really saw me without me having to explain or justify or prove anything. And they don't see you, Eli said, his voice muffled against my shoulder. No, they don't. And I've spent long enough trying to make them. I'm done now. Good, he said fiercely. They were mean. I laughed despite everything hugging him tighter. We stood there for a moment in my beautiful entryway, the fire crackling in the next room, the mountains dark and silent outside the windows. I felt lighter than I had in years. Tired, yes, shaken, but free in a way I'd never experienced before. My phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet house. I pulled it from my pocket and looked at the screen. The name there made me freeze. Dad, my father, who'd divorced my mother 5 years ago, who'd moved to Arizona and slowly faded from my life until we barely spoke at all, who hadn't called me in months, maybe longer. His name glowed on the screen, waiting. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the answer button, wondering what he could possibly want now. Eli was watching me with those two observant eyes. Are you going to answer it? I pressed the green button before I could change my mind. Dad, Julia. His voice was rougher than I remembered, worn at the edges. I heard they were there. At your house. Are they gone? I walked to the window, looking out at the darkness where their taillights had disappeared. How did you know they were here? Brian called me. Asked if I knew about your Colorado property. Wanted my help convincing you to share. A bitter laugh. I told him to go to hell. Something in my chest loosened slightly. They just left. Good. A pause long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. Then, Julia, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you years ago, but I was a coward. I'm still a coward, but I can't keep this to myself anymore. I sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. What is it I knew? His voice cracked on the words. About your grandmother's trust. About what Brian and your mother were planning. Not at first, but I knew. The world seemed to tilt. What do you mean, you knew? 15 years ago, right after your grandmother died, I found an email on your mother's computer. She'd left it open and I saw it by accident. It was to Brian. They were discussing how to handle the trust, how to keep you from finding out about it. I confronted her and she told me if I said anything she'd destroy me. Take the house, my business, everything. She said you were young and resilient, that you'd be fine, that Brian needed help, and you didn't. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. I was weak, he continued, and I could hear tears in his voice now. I told myself I'd find proof, build a case, do it the right way. But I never did. I stayed in that marriage for another 10 years, watching them gaslight you, watching you pull away, and I said nothing. I chose my comfort over your truth. Why are you telling me this now? My voice sounded hollow, distant. Because 5 years ago, when I finally left her, I made myself a promise. I would spend however long it took gathering real evidence. Not suspicions or accidentally seen emails, but hard proof that would stand up in court. I hired a forensic accountant. I paid a lawyer to help me request old bank records. Every time Brian or your mother threw away a piece of paper, I went through the trash. It took years, Julia. Years of piecing together a trail they'd tried so hard to hide. Dad, let me finish. Please. He took a shaky breath. Last week, I completed the file. 47 documents. Emails between your mother and Brian, planning the embezzlement. Bank statements showing the withdrawals. forged signatures on loan applications, a paper trail of every fraudulent transaction going back to 2015. It's bulletproof. It's everything you'd need to press charges to get justice, to make them pay for what they did. My hand was shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone. Eli climbed onto the couch beside me, pressing close. "I'm sending it to you now," my father said. "Encrypted file? Password is your grandmother's maiden name, all lowercase. It's called Lane Family Truth, zip." I heard my email chime as the file arrived. I stared at it on my phone screen, 147 megabytes of evidence of vindication of everything I'd needed for so long. "There's one more thing," he said, and now his voice was barely a whisper. "That loan in 2012, the $180,000 loan Brian took out in your name." "I paid that off," I said. "It took me 5 years, but I paid every penny." "No," my father said. "You didn't." I froze. "What? You paid 60,000 of it? The payments you made from 2012 to 2015, working yourself to death, living on nothing. But in 2013, the loan was suddenly paid in full. You thought you'd finally cleared it right, thought your budgeting and sacrifice had worked." "Yes," I whispered. "It was me. Julia, I sold my company. The engineering firm I'd spent 20 years building. I got $900,000 for it. I used most of it to pay off your debt, and I made sure it looked like it came from you. Like you'd somehow found the money and made one large payment. I wanted you to think you'd done it yourself." Tears were streaming down my face now. Eli hugged me tighter, not understanding but offering comfort anyway. "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to feel strong, self-sufficient. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me or like I'd rescued you. You'd already been made to feel small enough. I wanted you to believe in your own power, your own capability. But I was there, Julia, in the shadows trying to fix what I'd been too weak to prevent." "Dad," I could barely speak through the tears. "Why didn't you tell me sooner about any of this?" "Because you deserved to believe you were strong on your own, and you are. You built an incredible career, bought that house, made a life that has nothing to do with them. You did that, not me, not anyone else, but now," his voice hardened, "now they've come after you. They're not going to stop. And I realized you don't just need to be strong anymore. You need weapons. You need proof. You need everything I've spent 5 years collecting." I sat there in my beautiful house holding my phone with one hand and Eli with the other, staring at that encrypted file on my screen. Inside it was everything, the truth, the evidence, the power to destroy the people who destroyed me. "Thank you," I whispered. "I love you, Julia. I always have. I just didn't love you well enough when it mattered most." We stayed on the phone for another hour while he walked me through the evidence, explaining each document, each piece of the puzzle he'd painstakingly assembled. When we finally hung up, I sat in the darkness with Eli asleep against my shoulder and opened that file. 47 documents. A decade and a half of theft laid bare in emails and bank statements and forged signatures. My mother's words, "Make it last." Brian's response, "Don't worry, she'll never know." They'd been so certain I would never find out. So confident in my invisibility. They were wrong. I woke the next morning with Eli curled against my side, both of us still fully clothed, the laptop open on the coffee table, where I'd finally closed it around 3 a.m. My neck ached from sleeping at an odd angle, and my eyes felt gritty from crying and staring at screens for hours. The evidence my father had sent was burned into my mind now. Every email, every forged signature, every calculated lie. I carried Eli to his bedroom without waking him and tucked him in properly, pulling the quilt up to his chin. He stirred slightly, murmuring something I couldn't make out, then settled back into sleep. I stood there for a moment, watching the peaceful rise and fall of his breathing, and felt a fierce protective surge that made my chest tight. This child had lost everything, and I would be damned before I let anyone hurt him the way I'd been hurt. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching dawn break over the mountains. The sky was that particular shade of pale blue that comes just before sunrise, and fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering everything in pristine white. It was beautiful, peaceful, exactly what I'd come here to find. Then I saw the car. My mother's rental parked in my driveway again. I hadn't heard them arrive. They must have come early, or maybe they'd never really left, just driven into town to find a hotel and returned at first light. The audacity of it took my breath away. I'd thrown them out, locked the door behind them, and here they were again as if my boundaries meant nothing. I watched as the car doors opened. My mother emerged first, then Brian, then Amanda, looking even more uncomfortable than yesterday. They stood in my driveway, clearly working up the courage to knock again, having some kind of hushed argument I couldn't hear through the glass. I was debating whether to answer the door or simply ignore them, when Eli appeared at my elbow, still in his pajamas, hair sticking up in every direction. "Is that them again?" he asked, peering out the window. "Yes. Do you want me to stay in my room?" I looked down at him, at this small person who'd been through so much, and still asked what I needed, instead of what he wanted. "No," I said. "You live here. This is your home. You don't have to hide." His face brightened. "Can I go play in the snow? I saw a sled in the garage yesterday." "Bundle up first. It's cold out there." He ran to get dressed, and I heard him thumping around in his room, pulling on layers. By the time he came back out, wearing snow pants and boots and a puffy jacket that made him look like a small, cheerful marshmallow, my family was knocking on the door. I didn't answer it. I simply watched through the window as Eli ran past them, dragging his sled toward the hill behind the house. He was laughing, his breath making clouds in the cold air, completely oblivious to their presence, or at least choosing to ignore it. They noticed him immediately. I saw Brian point, saw him say something to my mother. Then he was marching toward Eli, and I was out the door before I'd consciously decided to move. "Hey!" Brian called. "Kid, whose kid are you?" Eli stopped, turning to look at this strange man shouting at him. I was already halfway across the yard, my slippers soaking through in the snow, but Brian reached him first. "I'm talking to you," Brian said, not unkindly, but with that entitled assumption that children owed him answers. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "I live here," Eli said simply. Brian turned to look at me as I approached. "Julia, who is this?" "My godson," I said, putting my hand on Eli's shoulder. "Not that it's any of your business." My mother had come closer now, her eyes narrowed as she studied Eli. "Your godson. Since when do you have a godson?" "Since his mother was my best friend," I said. "Since she died in a car accident 14 months ago and named me his guardian. Since I adopted him 6 months ago." Amanda's hand went to her mouth. My mother just stared. "You adopted a child and didn't tell us." Brian's voice rose. "That's insane, Julia. You can't just take in some random kid without consulting your family." "He's not random," I said, my voice cold. "His name is Eli. His mother was Sarah Chen. We met in college and she was the best friend I ever had. When her parents disowned her for having Eli outside of a marriage, I was the one who drove her to the hospital. I was the one who held her hand while she gave birth. I was at every birthday party, every school play, every midnight crisis. And when she died, I was the person she trusted most in the world to take care of her son." "But you never told us." My mother said, and there was something accusatory in her tone, as if I'd committed some crime by keeping this private. "No," I agreed. "I didn't, because I knew exactly what you'd say. That I was taking on too much, that I wasn't equipped to be a mother, that I was making a mistake. I didn't need your judgment about the one purely good thing I've ever done." "We would have supported you," my mother said, but the words rang hollow, even as she spoke them. "Would you?" I asked. "The way you supported me at Christmas, the way you included me in family photos, the way you... Aunt Jules." Eli was looking up at me, his small gloved hand finding mine. Then he looked at Brian, at my mother, at Amanda, standing awkwardly behind them. His voice was clear and innocent and devastating in its honesty. "Are these the people who made you cry at night?" The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the colour drain from Amanda's face, saw Brian open his mouth and close it again without speaking, watched my mother's carefully constructed expression crack just slightly. "You cried?" Amanda asked quietly, and she was looking at my mother now, not me. "She cried, and you knew?" Eli pressed closer to my side. "She tried to be quiet," he said, still in that innocent, matter-of-fact voice. "But sometimes I heard her on the phone after you called. She'd say she was fine, but then she'd cry." A child's honest observation delivered without malice or agenda, cut deeper than any accusation I could have made. Amanda was still staring at my mother, waiting for an answer that didn't come. Brian had gone very still, his face unreadable. My mother's mouth opened and closed, but for once in her life she seemed unable to find words. Eli, oblivious to the tension he'd created, tugged on my hand. "Aunt Jules, can I show them the picture? The one you told me about?" My heart sank. I knew exactly which picture he meant. "Eli, you don't have to..." "But you said it helped, you understand?" He insisted, pulling out his phone, with the determination only a 10-year-old could muster. He'd asked to see photos of my family a few months ago, trying to understand why I never talked about them, why we spent holidays alone. I'd shown him one picture, thinking it would help him understand that some families just didn't work the way they should. I hadn't realised he'd saved it. He found it quickly and held up the phone to Brian, who took it automatically. I watched Brian's face as he looked at the screen, saw the moment he recognised what he was seeing. It was from last Christmas, the one before I'd been told not to come back. Someone had been taking a family photo in the living room, all of them gathered around the tree. Brian and Amanda and their kids in front, my mother and some cousins in the back, everyone smiling at the camera. And there, visible through the doorway, in the background, standing in the kitchen, by herself, was me. I was turned slightly away, looking at something outside the frame. I hadn't known anyone was taking the picture. Hadn't known I'd been captured in that moment of exclusion, visible, but separate, present, but unwanted. "See," Eli said, pointing at the screen. "Aunt Jules is right there, but nobody asked her to be in the photo. She told me she stood there for a while waiting to see if anyone would notice her, but nobody did. That's when she knew they didn't want her at their table." Brian's hand was shaking slightly as he looked at the photo. Amanda moved closer to see, and I heard her sharp intake of breath. Even from where I stood, I could see it clearly. The painful visual proof of everything I'd been trying to explain. I wasn't cropped out of this photo. I was simply never invited in. "She used to cry after you called too." Eli continued, his voice still matter-of-fact, still innocent. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was just sharing what he knew, the way children do. Especially after Christmas. She'd talk to you on the phone and say everything was fine, but after she hung up, she'd go to her room and cry. I could hear her through the wall. I asked her once why she kept calling people who made her sad, and she said sometimes you love people even when they hurt you. My mother found her voice then sharp and defensive. "Eli, sweetheart, you're a child. You don't understand adult relationships. Sometimes conversations can seem upsetting when they're really just normal family discussions. Children exaggerate. They misunderstand things they overhear." "I didn't misunderstand," Eli said, and there was something stubborn in his voice now. "I know what crying sounds like. My mum cried a lot after her parents stopped talking to her. It sounds the same." The comparison hung in the air like an accusation. Brian handed the phone back to Eli with unsteady hands not meeting my eyes. Amanda was crying now, silent tears running down her face as she stared at my mother. "You knew," Amanda said quietly. "All this time you knew she was hurting and you just kept doing it." "That's not fair," my mother snapped. "Julia is oversensitive. She always has been. We can't walk on eggshells just because she takes everything personally. Family is complicated. There are dynamics at play that a child wouldn't understand." I understand that Aunt Jules was sad, Eli said, his voice smaller now, uncertain in the face of my mother's anger. I understand that she tried really hard to make you like her, and it never worked. He pressed against my side, and I put my arm around him, feeling him tremble slightly. He was picking up on the tension now, realizing that his honesty had created something uncomfortable and volatile. Brian cleared his throat. Julia, we didn't realize you felt... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Didn't realize, I asked quietly, or didn't want to see. He had no answer for that. Amanda was still crying, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with tears. I watched you sit at the kids' table at Christmas. I watched your mother introduce you to guests like you were an afterthought. I saw that photo being taken, and I saw you standing in the background, and I didn't say anything. I didn't think it was my place, but I should have. God, I should have said something. This is ridiculous, my mother said, her voice rising. We're being condemned by a child who doesn't understand what he's talking about. Julia, you're letting him repeat things out of context, making us look like monsters when we've done nothing but support you your entire life. I felt Eli flinch against me, felt him start to withdraw, and something in me that had been held in careful control for 36 years finally broke free. I looked at my mother, at her defensive posture and angry eyes, at the way she was trying to rewrite reality, even as it stared her in the face, and I spoke with a clarity I'd never managed before. Children don't lie about pain, Mum. They just repeat what they witness. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop moving through the pine trees. Mother's face went through a series of expressions, shock and anger, and something that might have been shame, though it was gone too quickly for me to be sure. Brian was staring at the snow. Amanda was crying harder now. Eli held on to me like I was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unstable. And I stood there in my snow-soaked slippers with my godson pressed against my side and waited to see what would happen next. What happened was nothing. They left. No apologies, no acknowledgements, just a slow retreat to their rental car and the sound of tyres crunching on snow as they drove away. Brian didn't look back. Amanda did once her face streaked with tears. My mother stared straight ahead, her spine rigid, with something that might have been shame or might have been rage. I honestly couldn't tell anymore. Eli and I went inside. I made hot chocolate, and we sat by the fire while he told me about the sled hill. He'd found his words tumbling over each other with the breathless enthusiasm of a 10-year-old who'd briefly forgotten the heavy adult drama he'd just witnessed. I let him talk, grateful for the normalcy of it, for the reminder that not everything in life had to be complicated and painful. That was Monday. By Wednesday, I'd almost convinced myself that maybe finally they would leave me alone. I should have known better. The first sign came on Thursday morning. I was checking my email over coffee, scrolling through client updates and market reports, when I saw a Google alert I'd set up years ago for my own name. It was a professional precaution, something my mentor had taught me early in my career. If clients were talking about you online, you needed to know. The alert showed 3 new mentions. I clicked through, expecting the usual, a comment on a finance forum, where I'd given advice, maybe a reference from a satisfied client. Instead, I found myself staring at a post from someone named Jennifer M., claiming to be a former client. Julia Lane ruined my retirement, the post read. She gave me fraudulent financial advice that cost me my life savings. I trusted her and she destroyed my future. If you're thinking of working with her, run. My coffee went cold in my hands as I read it again. Jennifer M. I didn't have any clients named Jennifer. I pulled up my client database, searched every variation of the name. Nothing. This person didn't exist. But the post was real, and it had already been shared 47 times. I found the second post on a different forum, this one from Robert K., and claiming I'd pressured him into risky investments that tanked his portfolio. The third was on a financial advisory review site, 1-star anonymous, saying I was unethical and incompetent. None of these people were real. None of these situations had ever happened. But there they were, permanent records on the internet, my name attached to accusations of fraud and incompetence. My phone rang. I grabbed it, thinking it might be my office, but the number was blocked. I answered anyway. Julia? It was Brian's lawyer, the same one who'd filed the partition action. His voice was smooth, practiced. I think we should talk about a settlement. This property dispute could get very ugly very publicly. It would be in your best interest to negotiate now before things escalate further. There's nothing to negotiate. I said, my voice steady despite the way my heart was pounding. You have no legal claim to my property. That's not exactly true. Your grandmother's estate is complicated, and these things can take years to sort out in court. Years of legal fees, years of publicity, years of your professional reputation being questioned while the case drags on. Wouldn't it be easier to just reach an agreement? Say a fair percentage of the property value. 30% seems reasonable for family. 30% of $7 million. It's not about the money, Julia. It's about doing right by your family. I hung up without responding. Over the next 2 days, the posts multiplied. More fake clients, more horror stories, all of them lies. Someone had created an entire campaign, multiple accounts, coordinated timing, professional-looking complaints that were just plausible enough to seem real. I reported every post I found, but they kept appearing faster than I could flag them. On Saturday, a finance blog picked up the story. Questions surround top financial advisors' ethics, the headline read. They'd aggregated all the fake complaints, presented them as if they were legitimate concerns that deserved investigation. My name was being dragged through the mud on websites I'd never even heard of. I called my office on Monday morning to give them a heads up to explain that someone was running a smear campaign. My boss, Patricia, listened quietly and then said she'd already heard. Someone had sent an anonymous email to the company's ethics hotline over the weekend, including what looked like bank statements showing suspicious transactions in my accounts. She knew they were fake, she assured me. The formatting was wrong, the account numbers didn't match, but protocol required an investigation. How long? I asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. We have to be thorough. You understand. I understood. I understood that Brian had found a way to hurt me that didn't require him to face me directly, that he could attack from a distance, hide behind anonymous posts and fake documents, and watch as my career imploded. I'll need you to work from home during the investigation, Patricia said, and I could hear the apology in her voice. It's not that we don't trust you, Julia, it's just optics. If clients see you in the office while there are allegations floating around, I understand. I said because what else was there to say? The official email came an hour later, formal and cold. We need to discuss serious allegations. You're suspended pending internal investigation, effective immediately. I sat there in my beautiful kitchen, looking out at the mountains that had promised me peace and felt the world I'd built so carefully begin to crack beneath my feet. Brian wasn't trying to take my house anymore. He was trying to take everything. For 3 days, I watched my professional reputation disintegrate online. Every morning brought new fake reviews, new anonymous accusations, new forums where strangers debated whether I was incompetent or malicious. My phone rang constantly with calls from concerned clients, friends who'd seen the post, journalists looking for a statement. I stopped answering. What was there to say? Defending yourself against lies only makes you look guilty. Everyone knows that. Eli asked me once if I was okay. I told him I was fine, and he looked at me with those 2 knowing eyes and said, "You don't have to pretend for me, Aunt Jules." So, I stopped pretending, at least with him. I told him someone was spreading lies about me, and he asked why I didn't just tell everyone the truth. I tried to explain that sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as the story people want to believe. That's stupid, he said with the blunt honesty of childhood. He was right, it was stupid. But it was also reality. On the 4th day, I was sitting by the fire with my laptop scrolling through the latest damage when I came across a photo on my phone. Susan the decorator had taken it a few weeks ago. I was at the community centre in town helping distribute winter coats and Christmas gifts to families who couldn't afford them. It was something I'd done every year since I'd started making real money quietly through local charities that didn't publicise their donors. In the photo, I was crouched down next to a little girl, maybe 6 years old, helping her try on a pink winter coat. The child was beaming. I was smiling genuinely, the kind of smile I never managed in family photos. I looked at that image for a long time. Then I posted it on Instagram, the same account where the viral photo of Silver Pine had appeared. I didn't write a defense. I didn't explain the accusations or list my credentials or provide evidence of my innocence. I simply posted the photo with 4 words. Some things don't need explanation. Character shows itself. Then I closed my laptop and went to make dinner with Eli, fully expecting the post to disappear into the noise of the internet. One voice among millions, meaningless and forgotten. I was wrong. By the next morning, the post had 3,000 comments. I opened it with my coffee, curious, but not hopeful, expecting more attacks, more poison. Instead, I found something I hadn't anticipated. The first comment was from a woman named Patricia Morales. Her profile showed a woman in her early 50s smiling in front of a small bakery. "This is the woman who saved my life 10 years ago," she'd written. "I was homeless with 3 kids. My husband had left. I'd lost my job. We were living in our car. Julia Lane gave me a $50,000 loan with 0 interest and no repayment schedule. She said, 'Pay it back when you can, or don't just take care of your kids.' I used that money to get an apartment, get back on my feet, start my bakery. I paid her back over 5 years and she never once asked for a payment. She never told anyone. She just helped because she could. These accusations against her are lies. I know who she really is." I stared at the comment, my coffee growing cold in my hands. I barely remembered Patricia. She'd been a client's sister, someone I'd met at a holiday party who'd broken down crying in the bathroom about her situation. I'd written her a check the next day, told her it was a loan so she wouldn't feel like charity, but I'd never expected or wanted repayment. When she'd insisted on paying me back, I'd accepted because I understood pride. But I'd never thought about it again. It was just something you did when you had resources, and someone else didn't. The comments kept coming. Julia Lane mentored me for free when I was trying to break into finance, spent hours reviewing my resume, connected me with contacts, never asked for anything in return. She helped fund my daughter's medical treatment when insurance denied the claim, anonymous donation through our GoFundMe. We only found out it was her years later. I was her client for 8 years. She never pressured me into risky investments. She always put my family's security first, even when it meant smaller returns. These fraud accusations are complete nonsense. Hundreds of comments, thousands, people I'd helped over the years, connections I'd made, kindnesses I'd forgotten about or never thought twice about. They were all coming forward, all telling their stories, all pushing back against the narrative Brian had tried to create. And then, the internet did what the internet does best. It started digging. Someone noticed that all the fake negative reviews had been posted within a 48-hour window. Someone else noticed they all used similar language patterns, likely written by the same person or small group. A user, with the handle Finance Watchdog, pulled up my actual professional record, 15 years of client satisfaction, 0 complaints to regulatory bodies, multiple industry awards. Then, someone found Brian. It started with a Reddit post titled, "Who is Julia Lane's accuser?" Someone had done basic research, found that her brother, Brian Lane, had been named in multiple business fraud cases over the past decade. Then, they found the loan documents, public records from courts where creditors had sued Brian. My name appeared over and over as a guarantor. The same Redditor posted screenshots with my signature side by side. The forgeries were obvious once you looked closely. The thread exploded. More people dug deeper. They found Brian's failed businesses, his gambling debts, the trail of people he'd scammed. They found news articles about his various bankruptcies. They connected him to the anonymous email sent to my company, traced the IP address to a coffee shop near his house. Within 24 hours, the narrative had completely flipped. The top post on the finance subreddit, with 40,000 upvotes, had a title that made my hands shake when I read it. Julia Lane's brother is the real fraud. He's been stealing her identity for over a decade. She's the victim. I read that sentence over and over, letting the words sink in. The truth was out there now, not because I defended myself, but because strangers on the internet had cared enough to look. It felt surreal, watching justice happen without my intervention, watching the narrative shift in real time, as more people dug deeper into Brian's history. The avalanche started small and built momentum. A former business partner of Brian's saw the Reddit thread and commented with his own story of being defrauded. Then another. Then a woman who'd invested in one of his failed startups and lost her entire retirement fund. The stories multiplied, each one adding weight to the mountain of evidence that Brian Lane was exactly what the internet had discovered him to be, a con artist who'd been using his sister's good name to cover his tracks for years. His company fired him within 48 hours. I saw the announcement on LinkedIn, carefully worded to avoid liability, but clear in its message. Brian Lane was no longer associated with their firm, effective immediately. Amanda filed for divorce 3 days later. I only knew because she called me crying, saying she'd had no idea, that she was so sorry, that she'd believed his lies about bad luck and tough breaks and family who didn't understand. I listened and said very little. What was there to say? My company reinstated me with a formal apology. Patricia called personally to say the investigation had cleared me completely, that the fabricated documents had been traced back to a computer at a coffee shop Brian frequented, that they understood I'd been the victim of a targeted campaign. I could return to work immediately, full restoration of all privileges and responsibilities. I thanked her and said I'd be back in 2 weeks. I needed time to think. 2 months passed. Winter deepened in the mountains. Eli started online school from Silver Pine, his bedroom transformed into a little classroom with a desk by the window where he could see the pine trees while he worked. I returned to my clients, managing portfolios, remotely rebuilding trust that had been damaged by Brian's lies. Most of them had stood by me. A few hadn't. I let those relationships go without fighting for them. But the financial pressure was real and growing. The lawyers handling my trust fund case charged by the hour, and those hours added up quickly. The property taxes on Silver Pine were substantial. The utilities for a house this size in winter were astronomical. I'd opened a bank account specifically for the Silver Pine Learning Centre. I was planning depositing money each month to fund it when it launched. Between everything, my savings account that had once held $7 million was down to $340,000. I did the math one night while Eli slept. 7 months. That's how long I could maintain everything at the current burn rate before I'd have to start making hard choices. Sell the penthouse maybe, take on more clients, cut back on the learning centre plans. I was doing that math when the legal notice arrived. The process server was apologetic, a young woman who looked uncomfortable handing me the thick manila envelope. I signed for it and took it inside my hand steady, even though something in my chest had gone cold and tight. Partition action. The words jumped out at me from the first page. Brian Lane petitioner, Julia Lane respondent. The lawsuit claimed that Silver Pine Estate was built on land that had been part of my grandmother's original property holdings and therefore part of her estate. Since Brian was an heir to that estate, he was entitled to his share. The filing demanded either a forced sale of the property with proceeds split between us, or a cash payout of 50% of the current market value, $3.5 million. I read through the entire filing, my coffee growing cold beside me. The legal argument was thin, barely credible. My grandmother had sold this land decades before she died. I'd bought it from completely unrelated third-party owners. There was no legitimate claim here. But that didn't matter. The lawsuit was real, and I'd have to defend against it. More legal fees, more time, more energy spent fighting instead of building. The hearing was scheduled for 30 days from now. I called back to my lawyer, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been handling the trust fund case. She read through the filing while I waited on the line, and I could hear her frustration in the long silence that followed. "This is harassment," she said finally. "Pure and simple. He knows he'll lose, but he's forcing you to spend money and time defending yourself. It's a war of attrition." "Can we get it dismissed quickly?" "I'll try, but judges usually let these things go to hearing, even when they're frivolous. Property disputes are tricky. We'll need to bring documentation showing clear title proof of the original sale from your grandmother's estate chain of ownership through to your purchase. It's doable, but it takes time." Time I didn't have. Money I didn't have. 3 days later, another envelope arrived. This one was from the county building department. Notice of violation. Someone had filed a complaint claiming Silver Pine had unpermitted construction. The main lodge expansion, the attached greenhouse I'd been building for the learning centre, even some of the interior renovations. The notice demanded I provide permits for all work completed in the past year, or face fines and potential demolition orders. I pulled out all my permits. They were in order, approved by the county, signed off by inspectors. But the notice insisted there were discrepancies, that an assessor would need to visit the property for a full inspection, that all construction must cease immediately pending review. I called the building department. The woman on the phone was apologetic but firm. A complaint had been filed. Protocol required investigation. The inspector could come out in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Right before the partition hearing. Sarah called me back that evening. She'd done some digging. The building assessor who'd signed off on the violation notice had a history of accepting bribes to create problems for property owners, then accepting more bribes to make those problems disappear. He'd been investigated twice, but never charged. And, according to her source, someone matching Brian's description had been seen meeting with him at a diner in town 2 weeks ago. I sat on my couch that night, Elias asleep upstairs, and looked at the 2 legal notices spread across my coffee table. Brian wasn't just attacking me anymore. He was attacking everything I was trying to build. Every dream I had for this place, every plan for the learning centre, every piece of peace I'd fought so hard to claim. The 3rd envelope arrived the next morning. Another legal document, this one delivered by certified mail. I opened it with hands that had finally started to shake. Partition hearing scheduled 30 days. Bring proof of sole ownership or property will be liquidated at auction. So I thought that was the worst they could do. Attack my home, my career, my financial stability. I thought I'd seen the depths of how far Brian would go to hurt me. I was wrong. The next envelope came 3 days later, and this one wasn't about property or money. This one was about Eli. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the return address. Family Court of Colorado. My hands went cold as I tore it open, my mind racing through possibilities. Had something happened with the adoption paperwork? Some technicality I'd missed? But the adoption had been finalised 6 months ago. Everything was legal. Everything was done. The first words I read made my knees buckle. Emergency petition for grandparents' rights and temporary custody. I sank onto the nearest chair and forced myself to keep reading. Margaret Lane, petitioner. Grandmother of Eli Chen seeking emergency custody on the grounds that the current guardian, Julia Lane, was unfit to care for the child. The petition listed reasons in cold clinical language. Mental instability, financial instability, isolated living conditions inappropriate for a developing child, history of professional misconduct, pattern of family estrangement indicating relational dysfunction. Each accusation was a knife carefully placed, designed to hit exactly where it would hurt most. The attached documentation made me physically sick. Someone had obtained my therapy intake forms from 3 years ago, when I'd first started seeing Dr. Morrison. But they'd been altered. Questions about normal stress and work-life balance had been edited to look like admissions of severe depression. My answer about occasionally feeling overwhelmed had been changed to make it seem like I'd reported suicidal ideation. The forgery was subtle enough that someone glancing quickly might not notice, but devastating in its implications. There was more. My work suspension had been presented not as a temporary investigation that cleared me, but as evidence of a pattern of professional failure and ethical violations. My choice to live in rural Colorado was characterized as isolating a vulnerable child from appropriate social services and educational opportunities. The fact that Eli did online school was framed as my inability to provide proper socialization. And then there was the claim that gutted me completely. Margaret stated under penalty of perjury that she had maintained a close relationship with Eli since his mother's death, that she'd been having weekly video calls with him, that she'd tried repeatedly to be involved in his life, that I had been preventing her from fulfilling her role as his grandmother. It was a complete fabrication. Margaret had met Eli exactly once during that confrontation in the snow. She didn't know his favourite colour, his teacher's name, what he liked for breakfast. She'd never called him, never sent a birthday card, never acknowledged his existence until the moment she decided he could be used as a weapon against me. My phone rang. I looked at the screen with blurred vision and saw Sarah's name. "You got it," she said without preamble. "The custody petition." "How is this legal?" My voice came out strangled. "She's not even his biological grandmother. Eli's mother wasn't related to my family at all." Colorado has broad grandparents' rights laws. They were originally designed for situations where parents die or become incapacitated, allowing grandparents who've had significant relationships with grandchildren to maintain contact. But the law defines grandparent loosely enough that your mother can claim standing because you're Eli's legal parent, now making her his legal grandmother. But she has no relationship with him. She's lying about everything. I know, and we'll prove that at the hearing. But Julia, there's something else you need to know. Sarah's voice dropped. I got a call from Brian's lawyer this morning, off the record. He wanted me to pass along a message. I waited, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. He said, if you proceed with criminal charges over the trust fund embezzlement, if you push to have Brian prosecuted, they'll use it against you in the custody hearing. They'll argue you're vindictive, that you're willing to tear apart Eli's extended family just for revenge, that you're putting your desire for vengeance ahead of the child's need for stability. They'll say you're trying to send Eli's uncle to prison and ask the court whether that's the kind of judgment a fit guardian exercises. That's extortion. It's strategy, ugly, unethical strategy, but not technically illegal. They're not threatening you directly. They're just pointing out how things might look to a family court judge. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. They'd found the one thing I cared about more than justice, more than my own vindication, more than anything, and they were holding him hostage. There's more, Sarah continued. Your mother's lawyer is apparently very expensive. Top family law attorney in Denver, known for winning custody cases. Someone's funding this, and I don't think it's your mother. My guess is Brian is pouring whatever money he has left into this fight. He knows he's going to lose the partition case. The property claim is nonsense, and any judge will see that. But the custody battle, that one has teeth. Family courts err on the side of caution. If they think there's even a possibility that Eli might be better off with your mother, they'll order evaluations, investigations, temporary custody arrangements while they investigate. How long does that take? Months, sometimes years. I thought about Eli upstairs doing his homework, humming some song he'd learned at the community centre, completely unaware that the people who'd hurt me were now coming for him. I thought about him being taken from this house, from the only stable home he'd known since his mother died, and placed with a woman who saw him not as a child, but as leverage. "What do I do?" I whispered. "We fight. We document everything. We show the court who you really are, who your mother really is, and we prove that Eli is exactly where he needs to be." "And the criminal charges against Brian?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "That's your call, Julia. But you need to know the custody hearing will be harder if you're actively trying to put your brother in prison. Fair or not true or not, that's the reality we're facing." After we hung up, I sat there with the petition in my hands, reading it again and again, each word a calculated cruelty. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew I would do anything, sacrifice anything, to protect Eli. Even my own justice. Even my own peace. The official court summons arrived by courier that afternoon, formal and final. Custody evaluation hearing 30 days. Petitioner Margaret Lane, grandmother. Respondent Julia Lane, current guardian. 30 days, the same timeline as the partition hearing. They'd coordinated this, timed it perfectly, so I'd be fighting on two fronts at once, spreading my resources, thin, forcing me to choose which battle mattered most. I looked up at the ceiling toward Eli's room, where I could hear him laughing at something on his computer, and felt something inside me shift from defensive to defiant. They'd made a mistake. They'd threatened the one thing I would burn the world down to protect. I called the meeting for Saturday afternoon. A simple text to my mother and Brian. "We need to talk. Silver Pine, 2:00. Come alone." I knew they'd interpret it as surrender, assume the legal pressure and custody threat had broken me exactly as they'd intended. Let them think that. Let them come expecting my capitulation. I called my father, separately. "I need you here," I said, "as a witness." "A witness to what?" His voice was wary. "The truth." He arrived an hour early, driving up from Arizona. He looked older than I remembered, greyer, more worn at the edges. We sat at the kitchen table while Eli played upstairs, and I told him what I was about to do. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he simply nodded. "I'll stand with you," he said, "whatever happens." My mother and Brian arrived exactly at 2. I watched from the window as they got out of their car, saw them exchange a look that I recognized as strategy coordination. They thought they knew how this would go. I opened the door before they could knock. "Come in." They entered cautiously, taking in the scene. My father sitting on the couch, me standing by the fireplace, the formal arrangement of it. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her voice warm. "Julia, sweetheart, I'm so glad you wanted to talk. This has all gotten so out of hand. We're family. We should be able to work things out." "Sit down," I said. Not an invitation, an instruction. They sat. Brian on the armchair, my mother on the other end of the couch from my father, as far from him as she could get. I remained standing my back to the fire and felt its warmth against my shoulders like courage. "I'm going to say something," I began, "and you're going to listen without interrupting. You've had 36 years to talk. Now it's my turn." My mother opened her mouth, but something in my expression stopped her. "For 36 years I tried to earn love from you. I thought if I was smarter, quieter, more successful, more useful, you would finally see me. You would finally choose me. But you taught me that love has conditions in this family, that worth must be proven, that some people are born into the picture, and some people are cropped out." My voice was steady. I'd practiced this, refined it, distilled every hurt and betrayal into words that couldn't be misunderstood or explained away. "You stole more than money from me. You stole my grandmother's memory. You let me believe for 15 years that the one person who loved me unconditionally had forgotten me. You took her final gift and spent it on gambling and failed businesses and lies. You used my name, my identity, my trust fund, my credit, as if I were a resource to be mined instead of a person to be loved." Brian started to speak, but I held up my hand. I found out about the embezzlement 3 months ago. My father sent me every document, every email, every piece of evidence of what you did. 47 documents proving fraud and theft and forgery spanning over a decade. I could have gone to the police that day. I could have destroyed you then. I saw confusion flicker across my mother's face, uncertainty about where this was going. But I didn't, because I had Eli to think about, a 10-year-old boy who'd already lost his mother. I didn't want him to watch me tear apart what was left of my family. Didn't want him to grow up knowing his aunt put his uncle in prison, even if that uncle deserved it. I wanted to protect him from that trauma. And I wanted to protect Dad, who'd spent 5 years gathering evidence, but who could be painted as complicit if this went public. My father's eyes were wet, but he said nothing. So I kept quiet. I decided to let you live with what you'd done to build my life away from yours, to find peace without vengeance. I chose mercy over justice. I chose protecting a child over punishing you. I walked to the table where I'd placed the leather portfolio my father had sent, the one containing all 47 documents. I picked it up, felt its weight. Then you came after Eli. The words fell like stones into still water. My mother went pale. You filed for custody of a child you've met once. You lied to a court claiming a relationship that never existed. You forged evidence of my mental instability. You attacked my career, my home, my finances, and when none of that broke me, you threatened to take my son. He's not your son, Brian said, his voice desperate. He's just some kid you adopted. You're not even related to him. He's more my family than you've ever been, I said quietly. And you used him as a weapon. That was your mistake. I placed the portfolio on the coffee table between us, opening it so they could see the first document. My grandmother's real will, her trust papers, the email chains between my mother and Brian planning the theft. This goes to the district attorney tomorrow morning. Embezzlement, identity theft, fraud, all of it. And I'm going to court to fight your custody petition with every resource I have. I'm going to tell the judge exactly what kind of people you are, exactly what you did to me, and exactly why Eli belongs with someone who loves him, instead of someone who sees him as leverage. My mother stood abruptly, her facade cracking. Julia, if you do this, you'll destroy this family. Brian will go to prison. I'll be charged as an accessory. Your father will be questioned. Everything will come out. Is that what you want? To tear us all apart? I looked at her, this woman who'd given birth to me but never really seen me, and felt nothing but clarity. You already did that, Mum. 36 years ago when you decided I wasn't worth loving. 15 years ago when you stole my inheritance. Last week when you came after my child. I'm not destroying this family. I'm just making it official. They left in silence. No arguments, no pleas, no final attempts at manipulation. My mother walked out with her spine rigid, Brian behind her with his shoulders slumped in defeat. My father stayed for another hour sitting quietly, while I made arrangements with Sarah over the phone confirming that yes, the evidence would be delivered to the district attorney first thing Monday morning. When he finally left, he hugged me at the door and whispered, "I'm proud of you." And I let myself believe him. Then I was alone. Eli was at a friend's house in town for a sleepover, his first since we'd moved to Colorado. I'd arranged it deliberately, wanting him away from the house during the confrontation, away from the aftermath. The silence without him felt profound, the house too big and too empty, echoing with everything that had just happened. I should have felt victorious, powerful. I'd stood up to them, set boundaries I'd never managed before, taken control of a narrative they'd written about me for 36 years. But instead, I felt hollowed out, scraped clean of something I hadn't known I was still carrying. I found myself in the study pulling old photo albums from the box I'd brought from New York. I hadn't looked at these in years, had barely glanced at them, when packing, but now I needed to see, needed to confirm what I already knew but had never fully acknowledged. The first album was from my childhood. There I was, at 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning my grandmother's arm around my shoulders. We were standing in front of a Christmas tree, and the way she was looking at me in that photo, pride and love written clearly across her face, made my chest ache. I turned the page. Another photo with my grandmother, this time at my high school graduation, her hands clasped together in joy. Another at my college acceptance, her eyes shining with tears. Every significant moment of my young life, she was there. Really, they're not just physically present, but emotionally invested, celebrating me. I kept flipping. Birthday parties, school events, family dinners, photo after photo of my childhood and adolescence. My grandmother appeared in dozens of them. My father in many. Brian, of course, front and centre in most. And my mother. She was in the photos, standing in the background or at the edge of the frame or positioned beside Brian with her hand on his shoulder. But there wasn't a single picture of her hugging me. Not one. Not at my graduation, not at Christmas, not at any birthday. In 18 years of documented childhood, there was no physical evidence that my mother had ever embraced me. I sat there on the floor of my study, albums spread around me like evidence at a crime scene, and felt something crack open inside my chest. It wasn't anger. I'd moved past anger. It was grief, pure and overwhelming for something I'd never had and never would. I pulled out my journal, the leather-bound one I'd been keeping since my therapist had suggested it years ago. I'd written in it sporadically, usually about work or goals or things I wanted to accomplish, but now I wrote something different. Today, I grieve something I never had. The mother who sees me, the mother who chooses me first, the family that celebrates my success instead of resenting it, the childhood where I belonged instead of having to earn belonging. I deserved better. I deserved love without conditions, presence without performance, acceptance without achievement. And it's okay to admit that. It's okay to mourn the family I should have had, even while I'm grateful for the life I built, despite them. The tears came, then hot and relentless, the kind that come from somewhere deep and primal. I cried for the 8-year-old sitting at the kids' table, for the 21-year-old being told her grandmother had forgotten her, for the 36-year-old still trying to prove she was worth loving. I cried for every Christmas, every phone call, every careful smile while my heart broke behind it. But this crying felt different from all the times before. This wasn't the desperate gasping sobs of fresh injury. This was release. This was letting go. This was finally accepting that some things can't be fixed, some relationships can't be salvaged, some people will never be who you need them to be, and that's not your fault. I'd spent my entire adult life building walls to contain this grief, thinking that if I just stayed strong enough, worked hard enough, proved my worth thoroughly enough, I wouldn't have to feel it. But strength isn't about not feeling pain. Strength is about having the courage to face it, to sit with it, to acknowledge it, and then choose to keep living anyway. I wasn't crying because I was weak. I was crying because I was finally strong enough to stop pretending, strong enough to admit that what happened to me was wrong, strong enough to grieve what should have been, strong enough to accept that my mother would never be who I needed, and that I could survive that truth. The tears slowed eventually, leaving me exhausted and clear-eyed, sitting among scattered photographs of a childhood that looked happy in still frames, but had been lonely in the moments between. I gathered the albums carefully, putting them back in their box. I would keep them, but I wouldn't need to look at them again. The truth they told had finally been absorbed, accepted, integrated. I washed my face, made tea, and was standing at the kitchen window watching the sunset paint the mountains gold when I heard the knock at the door, soft, almost hesitant. I assumed it was a neighbour or maybe the delivery person with a package. When I opened the door, My father stood there and he was holding a small wooden box I'd never seen before. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face drawn with exhaustion or emotion or both. "I couldn't leave yet," he said. "There's one more thing you need to have." I stepped back from the door, letting him in. He moved slowly like a man carrying weight that went beyond the small wooden box in his hands. We walked to the living room in silence, and he sat in the armchair near the fire, cradling the box in his lap like it was precious and fragile. I sat across from him, my face still raw from crying, too exhausted to put up any pretense. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his expression I'd rarely seen before. Regret, yes, but also a kind of desperate honesty, as if he'd decided that whatever came next, it would be the truth. "I need to say something," he began, his voice rough. "And I need you to let me finish before you respond." I nodded. "I chose keeping peace over protecting you for years, decades really. I saw what your mother did, how she favoured Brian, how she made you feel invisible. I watched it happen, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that she was just being a mother in her own way, that you were strong enough to handle it. But that was cowardice dressed up as neutrality." His hands tightened on the box. "When I found out about the trust fund, about what they were planning, I had a choice. I could have stood up to your mother. I could have told you. I could have gone to the police myself. Instead, I stayed quiet because it was easier, because confrontation terrified me, because I valued my comfort more than your truth." "Dad, please," he said. "Let me finish. I was a coward. I chose the wrong thing over and over again for 15 years, and that's unforgivable. I know that. I watched them gaslight. You watched you work yourself to exhaustion, trying to prove something you should never have had to prove. Watched you sit at that kid's table at Christmas, and I said nothing. I did nothing. And that makes me complicit in what they did to you." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. I could hear the wind outside, the familiar sound of pine branches moving against each other, and I thought about all the different kinds of harm. The active kind, where people hurt you deliberately, and the passive kind, where people watch it happen and turn away. "You're right," I said finally. "You did choose wrong. For years. You chose your comfort over my protection. You chose silence over truth. And yes, that hurt me. It still hurts." He flinched but held my gaze. "But you also spent 5 years gathering evidence when you didn't have to. You sold your company to pay my debt when you could have looked away. You gave me the weapons I needed to fight back when you could have stayed neutral. You chose wrong for a long time, Dad. But you gave me truth and evidence when it mattered most. And that counts for something." His eyes filled with tears. "Does it count enough?" I thought about that question about forgiveness and reconciliation, and the complicated math of love and damage. "I don't know yet, but it's a start." He nodded, accepting that, and carefully opened the wooden box. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a necklace I recognized from old photographs. 3 strands of pearls with a sapphire clasp. The pearls lustrous even in the firelight, the sapphire deep blue and flawless. My grandmother's necklace, the one she'd worn in every formal photo, the one she told me would be mine someday. "Brian pawned it," my father said quietly. 2015. I didn't find out until 2018 when I was going through old jewelry insurance policies during the divorce. I started searching for it then. It took me 3 years to track it down. The pawn shop had sold it to a private collector in California. It took another year to convince him to sell it to me. I paid 3 times what it was worth, but I didn't care. It was hers. It should be yours. He lifted the necklace carefully from the box, the pearls catching the light. "Your grandmother left specific instructions in her will. She wanted you to wear this on your wedding day. She said it was for the day you married someone who truly saw you, who loved you for exactly who you are." I reached out and touched the pearls cool and smooth under my fingertips. I thought about my grandmother, how she'd always made me feel seen and valued, how she'd known even then that I would need that reminder someday. "I'm not getting married," I said, trying to smile through fresh tears. "No," my father agreed, "but I think today is the right day for it anyway. Not a wedding day, something better. The day you chose yourself. The day you stood up and said enough. The day you stopped trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it and started protecting the love that matters. That's worth marking. That's worth celebrating." He stood and moved behind me, and I felt his hands gentle and sure as he fastened the clasp around my neck. The pearls settled against my collarbone warm from his hands, and I touched them again, feeling the connection to my grandmother, to the woman who'd seen my strength before I'd known it was there. "She was so proud of you," my father said, his voice breaking. "She used to call me those last few months before she died and tell me about your career, your accomplishments. She'd say, 'Julia's going to be extraordinary, and they're all going to miss it because they're too busy looking at Brian.'" She knew. She always knew. I stood and turned to face him, and for the first time in 20 years, maybe longer, I really looked at my father. Not as the man who'd failed me, not as the coward who'd chosen wrong, but as a human being who'd been broken by his own choices and was trying, however imperfectly, to build something better from the pieces. "Thank you," I said, "for this, for the evidence, for finally choosing me." "I should have chosen you from the beginning," he said. "Yes, you should have. But you're choosing me now, and Dad. That matters too." I stepped forward and hugged him, really hugged him for the first time since I was a child. He wrapped his arms around me and held on tight, and I felt him shaking, whether from relief or grief or some combination of both. We stood there by the fire, father and daughter, not fixed but maybe finally honest with each other. When we pulled apart, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm going to testify," he said, "when they investigate Brian and your mother. I'm going to tell them everything I know, everything I saw, everything I should have said years ago. I'm going to stand with you this time." "Thank you for finally choosing me, Dad," I whispered. He nodded, unable to speak, and I watched him walk back to his car through the gathering darkness, his shoulders a little straighter than when he'd arrived. That night I wore my grandmother's necklace to bed, touching the pearls as I drifted off to sleep, feeling connected to her in a way I hadn't since she died. When I woke the next morning, I knew what I had to do. I called Sarah and told her to proceed with everything. No more waiting, no more mercy, no more protecting people who'd never protected me. The evidence went to the district attorney that Monday, just as I'd promised. What followed was a slow grind of justice, the kind that happens in courtrooms and legal filings rather than dramatic confrontations. But it happened. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen on a crisp October morning, watching leaves turn gold on the aspens that lined my property, and took stock of how far everything had come. The district attorney had moved quickly once he saw the evidence. Criminal charges were filed within 3 weeks. Brian faced counts of embezzlement, identity theft, wire fraud, and forgery spanning nearly a decade. My mother was charged as a co-conspirator and accessory after the fact. My father testified at the preliminary hearing, his voice steady as he walked to the court through every document, every email, every piece of evidence he'd gathered. The judge found probable cause on all counts and set trial dates for the following spring. Both Brian and my mother were out on bail, but their passports had been surrendered, their movements restricted. Brian's lawyer had already approached Sarah twice about a plea deal. My mother's attorney was trying to negotiate immunity in exchange for testimony against Brian. I told Sarah I didn't care what deals they made as long as they admitted what they'd done. The custody case had been easier, clearer, more satisfying in its resolution. Margaret's petition had fallen apart under the most basic scrutiny. The judge had asked her during the preliminary hearing to describe Eli's daily routine, his favourite subjects in school, the name of his best friend. She couldn't answer a single question. When presented with phone records showing 0 calls between her and Eli, and when the so-called weekly video calls were proven to be fabrications, the judge had grown visibly angry. The psychiatric evaluation I'd undergone had come back showing no signs of instability, depression, or anything else Margaret had claimed. The home study of Silver Pine had described it as an ideal environment for a child offering both stability and enrichment. The petition was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. The judge had actually apologised to me from the bench, saying the court's time had been wasted by baseless accusations. Child Protective Services sent a formal letter of apology for having opened an investigation based on fraudulent claims. I'd framed it and hung it in my office, not out of vindictiveness, but as a reminder that sometimes the system works. The partition lawsuit had died even faster. Brian's claim that Silver Pine was somehow part of my grandmother's estate had been laughable to anyone who looked at the actual property records. The land had been sold by her estate in 2012 to a development company which had held it for 3 years, before selling it to the previous owners who'd held it for 7 years before selling it to me. There was no legal connection whatsoever between my grandmother's estate and my current ownership. The judge had thrown out the case at the first hearing, calling it frivolous and potentially sanctionable. Brian's lawyer had withdrawn shortly after unwilling to be associated with such transparent harassment. The building code violations had evaporated just as quickly once I'd presented my permits, and the assessor who'd signed the complaint had suddenly retired and moved out of state. But the best part, the part that made all the legal battles and sleepless nights and emotional exhaustion worthwhile, was happening today. The Silver Pine Learning Centre was opening. I'd spent the past 6 months transforming the property. The greenhouse I'd been building was now complete, a beautiful glass structure where kids could learn about growing food and sustainability. The guest house had been converted into classrooms with computers and whiteboards and comfortable furniture that didn't look institutional. The main lodge housed the common areas, a kitchen, where we'd teach cooking and budgeting, a library full of books about finance and entrepreneurship, and building wealth from nothing. 30 students had enrolled for our pilot program. Kids from foster care, from families struggling with poverty, from situations where they'd never been taught basic financial literacy. I was teaching them everything I wished someone had taught me: how to open a bank account, how to read a credit report, how to spot financial abuse, how to protect yourself from identity theft, how to build wealth even when you start with nothing. But more than the technical skills I wanted to teach them, something more fundamental: that their worth wasn't determined by their family, their circumstances, or anyone else's opinion. That they could build something extraordinary from broken ground. Eli had been my first volunteer, helping me set up the computer lab, greeting new students as they toured the facility, talking about his own experience of loss and finding home again. He'd grown 3 inches in the past 6 months, his voice starting to crack in that awkward puberty way, but his essential kindness remained unchanged. The opening ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock. I stood at the window, watching cars pull up the driveway, nervous and excited in equal measure. Parents and guardians brought their kids, social workers accompanied foster children. A few community leaders I'd invited arrived with cameras and notepads. And yes, there was a local news crew, which I'd agreed to only because the publicity would help us reach more kids who needed the program. I put on my grandmother's necklace, which I wore now for important occasions, feeling her presence like a blessing. Then I went outside to welcome everyone. The ceremony was simple. I gave a short speech about why financial literacy mattered, about breaking cycles of poverty and abuse, about giving kids tools to build independent, secure lives. The mayor said a few words. A social worker talked about the need for programs like this. Then we cut a ribbon and the kids rushed inside to explore their new space, their voices filling the lodge with excitement and possibility. The news crew interviewed me afterward, asking about my journey from that viral photo to this moment. I kept my answers focused on the kids, on the mission, on the future. But the reporter had done her homework. She'd read about the criminal charges against my family, the custody battle, the public redemption story, the internet had written about me. How does it feel, she asked, to turn something so painful into something so positive? I thought about that question, about my grandmother, about Eli, about every kid inside learning that they were worth investing in. It feels like coming home, I said simply. The next day, the local paper ran the story on the front page. The headline read, "From viral mansion to haven for hope." Life settled into a rhythm after that. The learning centre consumed most of my time in the best possible way. I taught classes 3 mornings a week, covering everything from basic budgeting to understanding credit scores to recognising financial manipulation. The students were hungry for knowledge, asking questions I'd never thought about, sharing stories that reminded me why this work mattered. Eli thrived in his role as peer mentor patient with the younger kids and protective of the ones who reminded him of himself a year ago. My clients continued to trust me with their portfolios, my reputation not just restored, but somehow strengthened by everything I'd survived. The legal cases ground forward slowly, but inevitably toward resolution. I'd almost convinced myself that this was what peace felt like. And then the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday in late November, handwritten on cream-coloured stationery, my mother's careful script instantly recognisable. I stared at it for a full minute before opening it, my coffee going cold beside me. The letter was 2 pages long. She'd written about the past 6 months, about therapy she'd started attending, about conversations with her own mother's journal she'd found while cleaning out the attic. She wrote about shame and regret and the slow, painful process of understanding how deeply she'd failed me. She didn't make excuses. She didn't blame anyone else. She simply acknowledged what she'd done and asked humbly if she might visit. Just once. Just to see me, to talk face to face, to try to begin what she knew would be a very long journey toward anything resembling reconciliation. "I don't expect forgiveness," she'd written. "I don't deserve it. But I'm asking for a chance to try to become someone who might someday earn it." I read the letter 3 times, looking for manipulation, for the carefully placed emotional hooks I'd learned to recognise over 36 years. But I couldn't find them. The letter felt different, smaller somehow, more honest. Eli found me at the kitchen table that afternoon, still holding the letter. He'd just gotten home from volunteering at the community centre, his cheeks red from the cold, and he poured himself hot chocolate before sliding into the chair across from me. "What's that?" he asked, nodding at the paper in my hands. "A letter from my mother." His eyes widened. "What does she want? To visit? To talk? She says she's changed." Eli sipped his cocoa thoughtfully. He'd become so much more confident over the past year, more willing to speak his mind, but he still chose his words carefully when it came to difficult topics. "Will you forgive her?" he asked finally. "Doesn't she deserve another chance?" I set the letter down and looked at this child who'd taught me so much about resilience and grace. "That's a complicated question, sweetheart. Let me try to explain something." He nodded, giving me his full attention. "There are 2 different kinds of peace," I said. "There's keeping peace and there's protecting peace. They sound similar, but they're completely different." "How?" "Keeping peace means sacrificing yourself for other people's comfort. It means staying quiet when you should speak up, accepting bad treatment to avoid conflict, pretending everything's fine when it's not. I spent most of my life keeping peace. I sat at kids' tables and smiled. I paid off debts that weren't mine and never complained. I let people hurt me over and over because I thought that's what family meant." Eli's face was serious, absorbing this. "And protecting peace. Protecting peace means choosing who gets access to you. It means setting boundaries and keeping them. It means saying no to people who have shown they can't be trusted with your heart. It means understanding that just because someone is family doesn't mean they automatically deserve a place in your life." So, which one is this? He gestured to the letter. That's what I'm trying to figure out. I can forgive my mother for what she did. Forgiveness isn't really about her, it's about me not carrying that anger anymore. I do forgive her. But forgiveness and trust are two completely different things. I forgive her, but I don't trust her. And trust isn't something she can ask for or demand. It's something that has to be rebuilt through actions, not words, over years, not weeks. So you won't see her. I didn't say that. I'm thinking about allowing one visit, supervised, in a public place, with your grandfather there as a witness, 1 hour with clear boundaries. Not because she deserves it, but because I want to see if her actions match her words. If she's really changed, she'll respect those boundaries. If she hasn't, she'll push against them. Either way, I'll know. Eli thought about this. What if she has changed? What if she really is sorry? Then I'll be glad for her. But that doesn't mean things go back to how they were, or even to some new version of normal. It means we start from zero with no expectations and no promises. Maybe in 5 years, if she consistently respects my boundaries and shows through her behaviour that she's different, we might have some kind of relationship. Or maybe we won't. Either way, I'm protecting my peace, not keeping hers. That makes sense, Eli said quietly. Then, I'm glad you're teaching me this stuff. My mom never learned how to do boundaries. Maybe if she had... I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Your mom loved you fiercely. She did the best she could with what she knew. And now you get to learn different tools so you can protect yourself better than either of us could. I called my father that night and asked if he'd be willing to be present for a supervised visit. He agreed immediately. I called Sarah and had her draft a formal letter, outlining the terms 1 hour coffee shop in town, my father present. No discussion of legal matters, no requests for future meetings without my explicit invitation. I sent it to my mother's attorney. She agreed to everything. The meeting was set for the following Saturday at 2:00. I arrived early with my father choosing a table near the window in the back corner. When my mother walked in, I barely recognised her. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. Her hair had gone almost completely grey, no longer dyed the careful brown I remembered. She moved carefully, like someone afraid of taking up too much space. She sat down across from me, her hands folded in her lap, and when she finally looked up and met my eyes, I saw something I'd never seen there before. Not pride or calculation or defensive anger, just raw, exhausted honesty. I see you now, Julia, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I'm ashamed I didn't see you before. I sat with those words, feeling their weight, examining them for sincerity. My father sat beside me, silent witness to this fragile moment. Outside the coffee shop window, early snow was beginning to fall, the first of the season. Thank you for saying that, I said finally. I needed to hear it, but I need you to understand something. Seeing me now doesn't erase 36 years of not seeing me. Shame doesn't undo damage. This isn't a reconciliation. It's just a beginning of a conversation that might someday lead somewhere, or it might not. She nodded, tears tracking down her face. I understand. We talked for exactly 1 hour as agreed. She didn't ask for anything, didn't make promises, just listened when I spoke and answered honestly when I asked questions. When the hour ended, she stood to leave and I saw her hesitate, as if she wanted to hug me. But she didn't. She simply said thank you and walked out into the snow. That took courage, my father said after she'd gone, from both of you. It's a start, I said. Maybe just a start. The weeks that followed brought me back to the work that mattered, to the learning centre and the kids who needed what I could offer. As December approached and the mountains turned white with snow, I found myself thinking about traditions, about the ways we mark time and growth and transformation. The first group of students was approaching the end of their initial programme, 3 months of intensive financial literacy training. and I wanted to give them something to take with them, something that would remind them of what they'd learned, not just about money, but about their own worth. That's when I remembered my grandmother's pine cone. I was sitting by the fire one evening, the golden ornament in my palm, when the idea came fully formed. I would create a tradition. Every student who completed the program would receive their own pine cone ornament painted gold, a symbol of resilience and deep roots and the ability to weather storms. I ordered 30 pine cones from a local craftsperson who collected them from the forest surrounding Silver Pine. They were beautiful, each one unique, and I painted them myself in the evenings, while Eli did homework at the kitchen table. Gold paint, careful and even transforming something ordinary into something meaningful. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for the week before Christmas. All 30 students would receive their certificates and their pine cones, and we'd hang them on the massive evergreen tree that dominated the great room, creating a living record of everyone who'd passed through these doors. The day arrived cold and bright, the kind of December morning where the sun on snow is almost blinding. Families filled the lodge, proud and nervous and hopeful. I stood at the front of the room with the pine cones arranged on a table beside me, each one in a small velvet pouch, each pouch tied with ribbon the same gold as the paint. I began by telling them about my grandmother. When I was 8 years old, I said, I felt invisible in my own family. I felt like I didn't matter, like I'd never be good enough, like I was somehow less than everyone around me. My grandmother saw that pain even when I tried to hide it. And one Christmas, she gave me this. I held up my original pine cone, the one I'd carried for 28 years through apartments and relationships and career changes and everything that had brought me to this moment. She told me I was her strongest pine. She said pine trees survive terrible storms because their roots grow deep even in rocky soil. They bend in the wind, but they don't break. They grow in places where other trees can't survive. And she wanted me to remember that I was like that, strong, resilient, capable of growing even when conditions weren't perfect. I looked at the students, these kids who'd survived foster care and poverty and family dysfunction, and losses most adults couldn't imagine bearing. You're all like that, every single one of you. You've survived storms that would break most people. You've grown in rocky soil. You've learnt to be resilient not because you had to, but because you chose to. And I want you to have something to remember that. One by one, I called their names and handed them their pine cones. Some cried, some laughed. Some held the ornaments like they were made of glass, precious and fragile. Eli went first since he'd been my first student, my first volunteer, my first example of what this place could mean. He took his pine cone and immediately went to the tree, finding a branch at eye level and hanging it carefully. "Come on," he called to the others. "Let's start our forest." The students followed, finding branches hanging their ornaments, standing back to admire how the gold caught the light. The tree began to glow with them, 30 points of light representing 30 stories of survival and growth. A girl named Maya, quiet and serious, had been standing back watching. She was 12, had been in 4 foster homes in 3 years, and rarely spoke in class. But now, she approached me holding her pine cone. "Ms. Lane." Her voice was barely audible. "What if our families don't want us back? What if we get strong and learn all this stuff and they still don't care?" I knelt down so we were eye level. "Then your roots grow somewhere else. And that's okay. That's more than okay. Pine trees don't need perfect families or perfect soil or perfect conditions. They just need to choose to grow. You get to choose your own forest, Maya. You get to decide where you plant your roots. The people who are supposed to love you are the people who show up, who see you, who celebrate your growth. Blood doesn't make family. Love does. Loyalty does. Respect does." She thought about that, nodded slowly, then walked to the tree and hung her pine cone next to Eli's. I stood watching as the last ornaments found their places, thinking about my grandmother, about everything she'd given me by seeing my strength before I knew it was there. The tree was almost covered now, a constellation of gold against green, each ornament representing a child who'd come through Silver Pine and learned that they were worth investing in. Eli stood at the centre of the group kids clustered around him, all of them looking up at the tree they'd created together. He turned to face them, his voice clear and certain. "This ornament is for all of us who grew stronger in the storm," he said, and every head nodded in understanding. I touched my grandmother's necklace, the pearls warm against my skin, and felt her pride as if she were standing beside me. This was her legacy, transformed and multiplied. This was what happened when one person chose to see another person's worth. It echoed forward, rippling out in ways you could never predict. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the pine forest in white, and inside 30 children stood together in front of a tree that glittered with proof that broken ground could grow extraordinary things. The graduation ceremony was covered by local news, and then picked up by a regional station, and then somehow found its way to a producer at a national morning show who was putting together a holiday special about people who'd transformed personal tragedy into community service. They called in early January, asking if I'd be willing to be interviewed. I almost said no. I'd never wanted to be the face of this story, never wanted my family drama to overshadow the work we were doing. But Sarah pointed out that national exposure could help us reach more kids, secure more funding, make the programme sustainable long term. So I said yes. The interview was scheduled for late January, exactly 1 year after that first photo of Silver Pine had gone viral and changed everything. The timing felt significant, like closing a circle I hadn't known I was drawing. They flew out a crew to film at the Learning Centre, wanting to capture the space, the kids, the work we were doing. I wore my grandmother's necklace, 3 strands of pearls that caught the light when I moved, and tried not to be nervous. The interviewer was a woman named Rachel Morris, probably in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a reputation for asking thoughtful questions. We sat in the great room near the Christmas tree that still held all 30 pine cone ornaments, the camera crew setting up lights and adjusting angles, while she and I made small talk about Colorado winters and the challenges of non-profit work. When they started filming, Rachel began with easy questions. How had the Learning Centre come to be? What did we teach? What kind of impact were we seeing? I answered honestly, letting my passion for the work show, talking about the students and their resilience and the transformation that happened when someone taught kids their worth wasn't determined by their circumstances. Then Rachel shifted her voice gentler. Your story has been very public over the past year. The trust fund fraud, the custody battle, the family estrangement. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was, I said simply. And now you've created something beautiful from that pain. Silver Pine has become known nationally as a model for how to teach financial literacy to at-risk youth. You've been featured in education journals, philanthropic magazines, even financial publications. Your family must be so proud of you now. The question hung in the air and I felt something settle in my chest. A year ago, that question would have hurt, would have opened up the wound of wanting their approval, needing their recognition, hoping that maybe this time, this accomplishment would finally be enough. But now, I looked at Rachel and felt only clarity. I honestly don't know if they are, I said, and for the first time in 36 years, I don't need to know. Rachel's eyebrows rose, slightly surprised by the answer. You don't need to know. No. For most of my life, I measured my worth by whether my family was proud of me. After every achievement, every promotion, every recognition, I'd wait for the phone call, the acknowledgement, the sign that I'd finally done enough to matter to them. But my worth isn't measured by their pride anymore. It's measured by my peace, by whether I can look at myself in the mirror and know I'm living in alignment with my values, by whether the work I'm doing matters to the people it's meant to serve, by whether I'm being honest about who I am and what I need. Their opinion of me isn't irrelevant exactly, but it's not the metric I use to determine if my life has value. Rachel leaned forward, engaged now in a way she hadn't been with the earlier questions. That's a profound shift. When did it happen? Was there a specific moment? I thought about that, about all the moments that had led me here. The empty chair at Christmas, the forged will, the speech by the fireplace, Eli's innocent honesty, my father's late redemption, the first pine cone hung on the tree. The day I stopped waiting for an apology and started building a life that didn't need one, I said. I realised I could spend the rest of my life trying to make people see me who were determined to look away. Or I could build something so meaningful that their blindness stopped mattering. I chose the latter. And once I made that choice, everything changed. Not because they changed. They didn't really. But because I stopped giving them the power to define my worth. Rachel was quiet for a moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a conversation that mattered. What would you say to someone watching this who's struggling with a similar situation, someone who's still waiting for validation from family members who may never give it? I looked directly at the camera, thinking about all the people out there who felt invisible in their own families, who worked themselves to exhaustion, trying to prove something that should never have needed proving. You are already enough. Right now, exactly as you are enough. You don't need anyone's permission to know your own worth. Not your parents, not your siblings, not anyone's. If the people who are supposed to love you can't see your value, that's information about them, not about you. And you're allowed to stop waiting. You're allowed to build a life that brings you peace instead of one that seeks their approval. You're allowed to love people from a distance. You're allowed to forgive without reconciling. You're allowed to choose yourself. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, but that moment was the one that mattered. When the crew packed up and left, Rachel hugged me at the door and said quietly, "Thank you. I needed to hear that too." The segment aired 2 weeks later during primetime holiday programming. I watched it with Eli, both of us sitting on the couch with hot chocolate, and felt oddly detached from the woman on screen. She looked confident, peaceful, certain. I barely recognised her as myself. Within hours, the clip had been shared across social media. But this time, it wasn't about the mansion or the drama or the family betrayal. It was about the message, about permission to stop waiting, about building lives that didn't require validation from people who couldn't or wouldn't give it. The comments poured in. Thousands of them. "I've been waiting for my mother to be proud of me for 40 years. Thank you for giving me permission to stop waiting." This is exactly what I needed to hear. I'm allowed to choose myself. My father will never acknowledge what he did to me, but I can still build a good life. Thank you for showing me how. I'm crying watching this. I thought I was the only one who felt this way. I read through them. That night, Eli asleep upstairs, the house quiet around me. So many people carrying the same wound, the same desperate need for approval from people who would never give it. And here I was, somehow giving them permission to set that burden down. One comment stood out from all the others. It was from an anonymous account, no profile picture, posted just an hour after the segment aired. "My grandmother would have been proud of you, just like yours is." I stared at those words, feeling my throat tighten. I didn't know who'd written them, would never know. But somehow, in that moment, I felt my grandmother's presence as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. She would have been proud, not because I'd achieved success or built something impressive or overcome impossible odds. She would have been proud because I'd finally learned to see myself the way she'd always seen me. Enough, worthy, strong as a pine tree with roots that grew deep. That realization carried me through the rest of winter and into spring, through the expansion of Silver Pine to include summer programs, through my second supervised meeting with my mother, where she again showed up humble and quiet and respectful of every boundary I'd set. Through Brian's trial, which ended with a plea deal 18 months in prison followed by probation and restitution. Through my mother's trial where she testified against Brian in exchange for reduced charges and community service. Through all of it, I kept working, kept teaching, kept building the life that didn't need their validation to matter. By the time the second Christmas approached, Silverpine had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. We had 60 students enrolled, 3 full-time teachers partnerships with foster care agencies across the state. The communal Christmas tree now held not just the original 30 pine cone ornaments, but 60 more, each one representing a child who'd learned they were worth investing in. Eli was 13 now, voicefully changed, shooting up in height, but still as kind and thoughtful as the scared 10-year-old who'd first arrived at my door. It was Christmas Eve, and we were hosting our first holiday dinner for current students and their families or guardians. The lodge was full of voices and laughter, the kitchen smelling of roast turkey and fresh bread. I was helping Maya set the long tables when Eli appeared at my elbow. "Aunt Jules, there's someone at the door." Something in his voice made me look up. "Who?" "I think it's your brother." My hand stilled on the tablecloth. "Brian." I hadn't seen him since that day by the fireplace, when I told him the evidence was going to the district attorney. He'd been convicted 8 months ago, sentenced to 18 months, and as far as I knew, he was supposed to still be serving that time. "I'll handle it," I said, wiping my hands on my apron. Brian stood on the porch, and I barely recognised him. He'd lost weight, his expensive clothes replaced with worn jeans and a jacket that had seen better days. His hair had gone grey at the temples, his face lined in ways it hadn't been 2 years ago. He looked old, tired, diminished. "Julia," he said, and his voice was different too, quieter, stripped of the entitled confidence I'd always associated with him. "Brian." I stayed in the doorway, not inviting him in. "You're supposed to be in prison." "Early release. Good behaviour. I got out 3 weeks ago." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I know I have no right to be here at all. I just wanted to say something, and I wanted to say it to your face." I crossed my arms, waiting. I lost everything. Amanda, the kids, my career, my reputation, every friend I had. I deserved all of it. I know that now. I spent 18 months with a lot of time to think about what I did not just to you, but to everyone I ever convinced myself I was entitled to use. The therapist in prison called it narcissistic personality disorder. I call it being an arsehole who hurt people because I could. A burst of laughter came from inside, one of the kids telling a joke. Brian flinched at the sound as if he knew he didn't belong anywhere near this warmth. "I'm working construction now. Day labour. It's honest work, which is more than I can say for anything I did before." He pulled a crumpled envelope from his jacket pocket, held it out to me. "This is $500. It's all I have right now. First payment toward the $180,000 you paid 12 years ago for the debt I stuck you with. I know it will take me 30 years to pay it back at this rate. I'll probably die before I finish. But I want to try. I'll send $500 every month. Not because it makes us even. We'll never be even. But because it's the only thing I can think of to do." I took the envelope, opened it. A check made out to me signed in Brian's handwriting. $500 from an account that probably didn't have much more than that in it. I looked at my brother, at this broken man who'd once been so certain of his superiority, and felt nothing like triumph. Just sadness for all the years he'd wasted being someone terrible. I tore the check in half, then in half, again. "Keep it," I said. "Use it for therapy instead. You need professional help more than I need money." His eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve that." "No, you don't. But I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because carrying anger at you was exhausting, and I don't want to do it anymore. Consider the debt forgiven, not forgotten. Forgiven. What you do with that gift is up to you." He nodded, unable to speak. I started to close the door, ready to return to the warmth and laughter inside, to the life I'd built that had nothing to do with him. But he spoke again, his voice cracking. Would you ever let me volunteer here, not for forgiveness, because I know I don't get that, but to teach kids what not to do, to use my failures as a lesson, to show them what happens when you think you're entitled to other people's resources and love and trust. I could be a cautionary tale. That's all I'm good for now, but maybe that's worth something. I studied him, this man who'd stolen from me, lied about me, tried to take my child, destroyed my peace over and over again for decades. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face. But another part, the part that had learned about mercy and boundaries and the difference between the two, considered the question seriously. I'll think about it, I said finally. If I decide yes, and that's a big if, you'd start at 0, background check, references, supervised shifts, no contact with students until you've proven yourself to my staff. No special treatment because you're my brother. Actually, probably higher scrutiny because you're my brother. And if you mess up, even once you're gone forever. 0 tolerance. Do you understand? Yes. And Brian, 0 is generous. It's more than you've earned. Don't make me regret it. I won't, he said. Then softer. Thank you. I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly. Eli appeared beside me, concern in his eyes. Are you okay? I think so, I said. That was harder than I expected. You didn't have to be nice to him. I wasn't being nice. I was being boundaried. There's a difference. I straightened up, squared my shoulders. Come on, we have a dinner to host. As I walked back toward the warmth and noise and life I'd created, I touched my grandmother's necklace and felt her approval. Not because I'd forgiven Brian exactly, but because I'd stayed true to myself while doing it, had protected my peace while offering a crumb of possibility. That, I thought, was what strength really looked like. I returned to the great room, where the long table stretched nearly the full length of the space, a table I'd commissioned specifically for moments like this. 60 chairs surrounded it, no seat more important than any other, no head or foot to denote hierarchy, just a circle of belonging that anyone could join if they earned their place through showing up, through kindness, through presence. The students were already finding their seats, comparing ornaments on the tree, helping the younger ones reach the dishes being passed. Staff members sat interspersed among them, not as authority figures, but as participants. Susan, the decorator, who'd become our facilities manager, was helping Maya carry the turkey to the table. James, our math teacher, was pouring cider for a group of foster siblings who'd just enrolled last month. Volunteers from the community sat with students they'd mentored, conversations flowing easily across age and background and circumstance. My father sat near the middle, talking with one of the older students about college applications, offering advice about financial aid with the patience he'd never shown when I was growing up. But he was learning. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. And at the far end of the table, almost hidden behind a cluster of teenagers, my mother sat quietly. She'd asked permission to come through, my father acknowledging that she had no right to expect an invitation. I'd said yes with conditions. She would come as a guest, not as family. No special acknowledgement, no seat of honour, no assumption of belonging. If she wanted to be here, she would earn it the same way everyone else had. She'd arrived early, offering to help in the kitchen, and had spent the afternoon peeling potatoes and washing dishes without complaint. Now she sat listening to the conversations around her, not inserting herself, not demanding attention, just present in a way she'd never managed to be when I was growing up. Eli appeared at my side, tugging my sleeve. Everyone's here. Should we start? I looked around the table at all these faces, these stories, these people who'd somehow become my family, not through blood, but through choice. My chest felt full, almost painfully so, with gratitude and love and a sense of rightness I'd spent 37 years searching for. Yes, I said. Let's start. I moved to stand near the centre of the table and the conversations gradually quieted. 60 faces turned toward me, expectant and warm. I picked up my glass of cider and everyone else did the same. "I want to say something before we eat," I began. "This table has no head. There's no most important seat, no hierarchy, no order of significance. Everyone here earned their place by showing up, not with perfection, because none of us are perfect, but with presence, with honesty, with the willingness to be real about who we are and what we need." I looked around the table, meeting eyes, seeing each person clearly. Some of you are here because you're students learning skills that will help you build secure futures. Some of you are here because you teach those skills, because you've chosen to invest your time and energy into the next generation. Some of you are here because you volunteer, because you've decided that community matters more than convenience. And some of you are here because you're family, but not the kind of family that's automatic, the kind you choose, the kind you build, the kind that stays. Bang! My voice caught slightly, and I paused to steady it. This is what family should be, not people who share DNA and demand loyalty without earning it, but people who show up for each other, who celebrate each other's growth, who make space for each other's truth. People who've proven through their actions that they deserve access to your heart. I raised my glass higher. To chosen family, to earned belonging, to everyone at this table who's taught me that home isn't a place or a bloodline. It's wherever people see you clearly and love you anyway. To chosen family, the table echoed voices, overlapping glasses raised. As we lowered our glasses, I heard my mother's voice so soft I almost missed it. "You built the family I should have given you." The conversations around us continued, people serving food and passing dishes, but in that small pocket of space, her words hung in the air. I looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she met my eyes directly. Tears tracked down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away. "I'm sorry, I couldn't," she finished. "I'm sorry I didn't know how. I'm sorry I was so focused on protecting Brian that I never saw I was destroying you. You deserved this your whole life, and I couldn't give it to you. But you gave it to yourself. And these kids will never know how lucky they are to have learned from you instead of from someone like me." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't redemption. It was just acknowledgement, raw and honest, and too late to fix what had been broken. But it was real. "Thank you for saying that," I said quietly. Before I could say anything else, Eli stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Everyone turned to look at him, this teenager who'd grown so much in the 3 years since his mother died, who'd transformed from a scared child into a confident young man who spoke his truth without apology. "I want to say something too," he announced, his voice clear and strong. "Before I came here, I thought family was just the people you were stuck with. My mum's family didn't want us because I was born outside of marriage. They said we were an embarrassment. And after my mum died, I thought I'd never have a family again." He looked at me and his eyes were bright with emotion. "But Aunt Jules taught me something different. She taught me that home isn't where you're born. It's where you're loved. It's where people see your worth without you having to prove it. It's where you can be yourself without apologizing. It's where you belong, not because you're related, but because you're valued." He gestured around the table, encompassing all of us. "This is home. All of you. You're my family, not because we share blood, but because we share something better. We share truth, we share support, we share the belief that everyone at this table matters exactly as they are." The silence that followed was profound. Then Maya started clapping and others joined, and soon the entire table was applauding, some people crying, everyone moved by the simple eloquence of a 13-year-old who understood what many adults never learned. Eli sat down, blushing but smiling, and I reached over to squeeze his hand. "Thank you," I whispered. "Just telling the truth," he said. The meal continued, plates filling with turkey and mashed potatoes and green beans and fresh bread. Conversations rose and fell, laughter, punctuating stories, the warmth of 60 people sharing space and food and presence. filling the room with something that felt almost sacred. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, snow began to fall, fat flakes drifting down to cover the pine forests in white. The Christmas tree in the corner glowed with 90 golden ornaments, now each one catching the light, each one representing a child who'd learned they were strong enough to survive storms. I sat at that table surrounded by the family I'd built and felt my grandmother's presence as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. This was her legacy, transformed and multiplied. This was what happened when one person chose to see worth in another. It rippled forward, creating circles of belonging that expanded far beyond anything you could imagine when you first planted the seed. My mother caught my eye from across the table and nodded just once, a gesture of understanding that required no response. My father laughed at something one of the students said. Eli piled his plate high with seconds. The staff traded stories about their most memorable teaching moments. The volunteers planned next semester's activities, and I sat in the middle of it all, touching my grandmother's pearls, watching snowfall and candles flicker and chosen family fill a space that had once felt impossibly empty, and knew with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. That Christmas dinner became a tradition, repeated every year, the table growing longer. As more students joined the program, more volunteers committed their time. More people found their way to Silver Pine and discovered what chosen family could mean. 5 years later, I stood in front of that same massive Christmas tree, but so much had changed. I was 41 now, my hair showing the first threads of silver at my temples, lines forming at the corners of my eyes from years of genuine smiling. Silver Pine had grown beyond anything I'd imagined that first year. We now had 3 branches across Colorado, each one a sanctuary for kids who needed to learn that their circumstances didn't define their worth. Over 500 families had passed through our programs, and the success stories kept coming. Former students sending photos of their first apartments, their college acceptance letters, their small businesses, their stable lives built on foundations of financial literacy and self-worth. Eli was 15 now, tall and lean, his voice settled into a deeper register, his baby face replaced by the angular features of approaching manhood. He taught financial literacy to the younger students twice a week, patient and kind, sharing his own story of loss and rebuilding with an honesty that made the kids trust him immediately. He was considering colleges now, talking about studying education or social work, wanting to spend his life helping others the way he'd been helped. Watching him grow into someone so fundamentally good made my heart ache with pride and gratitude. Brian's legal case had concluded years ago. He'd served 14 months of his 18-month sentence, released early for good behaviour, and as far as I knew, he was still working construction somewhere in Wyoming or Montana. He'd never contacted me again after that Christmas Eve conversation. I'd heard through my father before he passed that Brian was attending AA meetings and therapy, living in a small apartment, keeping his head down. Some people change. Some people don't. Some people need to lose everything before they're willing to do the work of becoming better. I'd made my peace with not knowing which category Brian fell into. His journey was his own, now separate from mine. My mother volunteered at Silver Pine every Wednesday morning, working in the kitchen, alongside other volunteers, chopping vegetables and washing dishes, and setting tables for our midweek community lunches. She never asked for special recognition, never mentioned our relationship unless someone else brought it up. Our interactions were cordial but boundaried. We talked about the weather, the students, the menu for the week. Sometimes she asked how Eli was doing in school. Once or twice a year, she asked if I was happy, and when I said yes, I could see something like relief cross her face. It wasn't the mother-daughter relationship either of us had needed, but it was honest, and in its own small way, it was enough. My father had passed away 2 years ago peacefully in his sleep in the Arizona house he'd moved to after the divorce. I'd been with him at the end, cooled down when the hospice nurse said it was time. We'd sat together in those final days, talking about everything and nothing, filling in the gaps of all the years we'd lost. He'd given me a letter the week before he died, sealed in an envelope with my name on it. "Read this after," he'd said, not before. I'd honoured that request. After the funeral, after I'd scattered his ashes in the Colorado mountains, as he'd wanted, I'd opened the letter and read his final words. You were always my pride, Julia. From the moment you were born, I saw something extraordinary in you. I'm sorry I waited so long to show it. I'm sorry I let fear make me silent when you needed me to speak. But watching you build Silver Pine, watching you become the person you were always meant to be, has been the greatest privilege of my life. You didn't need me to become this. You did it despite me. But I'm grateful I got to witness it. Thank you for giving me a second chance. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. I'd cried then, holding that letter, grieving, not just for what we'd lost, but for what we'd managed to find in those last few years. Imperfect reconciliation, honest acknowledgement, small redemptions. Now standing before the Christmas tree in the great room of Silver Pine, I looked up at the branches heavy with ornaments, hundreds of them, now each golden pine cone engraved with a child's name and graduation year. The tree had become a living memorial to every student who'd passed through our doors, a testament to resilience and growth, and the power of believing in your own worth. I held my grandmother's original pine cone in my hand, the one she'd given me 29 years ago, when I was 8 years old and feeling invisible. The paint had faded slightly, the edges worn smooth from decades of handling, but it was still beautiful, still meaningful, still the symbol of everything she tried to teach me about strength and survival and deep roots. I climbed the small ladder we kept beside the tree and carefully hung the ornament at the very top, the place of honour where it would catch the morning light and remind everyone who saw it that this whole journey had started with one person choosing to see another person's worth. As I climbed down, Eli appeared beside me, looking up at the tree with the same reverence I felt. It's beautiful, he said softly. It is. I agreed. People ask me sometimes. He said, if you regret it, everything that happened with your family, all those years of being treated badly, they ask if you wish it had been different. I smiled, touching my grandmother's pearls. What do you tell them? I tell them you said you didn't lose those years. You spent them becoming someone who could build this. He gestured around the room at the tree at the learning centre, visible through the windows at the life we'd created here. Was I right? You were exactly right. I pulled him into a hug, this boy who'd become my son in every way that mattered. Some people inherit love, Eli. They're born into families that see their worth and celebrate it and make space for them to grow. But some of us have to grow love from broken ground. We have to build it ourselves from scratch with our own hands and our own choices. And that's okay, he asked, even though he already knew the answer. More than okay, because roots that grow from broken ground run deeper. They're stronger. They survive storms that would topple trees planted in perfect soil. I looked up at my grandmother's ornament catching the light at the top of the tree. For the first time in my life, I'm not proving anything. I'm not working to earn approval or validation or love from people who are never going to give it. I'm simply living. I'm building something meaningful. I'm choosing peace over performance. I'm surrounding myself with people who've earned the right to be here. Snow had begun to fall outside the familiar sight of winter, returning to the mountains covering the pine forest, in white beginning another cycle of seasons and growth and survival. And that grandma? I whispered, looking up at the ornament that started it all. That's the truest inheritance of all. Eli squeezed my hand. From somewhere in the building, I could hear students arriving for evening activities, their voices bright with anticipation. My staff was preparing for tomorrow's classes. Volunteers were setting up for the week ahead. Everything I'd built continued to grow and expand and touch lives I would never personally meet. I'd spent 36 years trying to earn love from people who couldn't give it. But in the end, I'd learnt to give it to myself, to these students, to this place, to the chosen family that had grown around me like a forest, each person a tree with deep roots, all of us surviving storms together. The light still burned at Silver Pine, and it would burn long after I was gone, a beacon for every person who needed to learn what my grandmother had taught me all those years ago. You are stronger than you know. You can survive any storm. You can grow from broken ground. And you are always and forever enough. If you've made it this far in Julia's story, thank you for taking this journey with me. Stories like this one matter because they reflect truths many of us carry but rarely speak out loud. The pain of feeling invisible in your own family. The exhaustion of trying to earn love that should have been freely given. The slow, difficult journey of learning that your worth isn't determined by whether someone chooses to see it. Julia's story isn't just about inheritance fraud or family betrayal, though those elements drive the plot forward. At its heart, this is a story about a woman who spent decades believing she wasn't enough, only to discover that she'd always been enough and the people around her were simply looking in the wrong direction. It's about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, about setting boundaries without guilt, about building chosen families when biological ones fail you. These are lessons that resonate across generations, across cultures, across every demographic boundary we might imagine. What strikes me most powerfully about Julia's journey is her refusal to become bitter. She had every reason to seek revenge, to destroy the people who'd hurt her, to let anger consume her, the way it consumes so many people who've been betrayed by those they trusted most. Instead, she chose something harder and ultimately more meaningful. She chose to build, to create something that would outlast her pain, to transform her wound into wisdom that could help others avoid the same damage. That takes a kind of strength that doesn't make headlines but changes the world one person at a time. The Silver Pine Learning Centre represents something many of us need to hear. Your past doesn't have to define your future. The family that failed you doesn't get to write the ending of your story. You can grow strong roots even in rocky soil. You can survive storms that feel impossible. You can build a life of meaning and connection and peace, even when you start from a place of brokenness and betrayal. These aren't just pretty words. They're truths that Julia proved through her choices, through her courage, through her willingness to walk away from toxicity, even when walking away felt impossibly hard. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you struggled with the decision to set boundaries with people who share your DNA but not your values? Have you built your own chosen family from people who weren't related to you by blood but proved themselves through loyalty and love? Your stories matter. Your experiences validate others who are walking similar paths. This community we're building here is its own kind of Silver Pine, a place where people can share their truths without judgment and find connection in our common struggles. If Julia's story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships or choices or boundaries, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Every subscription tells me that these stories matter, that exploring complex family dynamics and paths to healing serves a purpose beyond entertainment. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. These narratives about resilience and redemption and realistic healing are what we specialize in here, and there are many more coming. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. You probably know someone who's struggling with toxic family dynamics, someone who's trying to decide whether to keep fighting for relationships that hurt them, someone who needs permission to choose their own peace over keeping someone else's. This story might be exactly what they need to hear right now. Sometimes we need to see someone else walk the path before we have the courage to take our own first steps. Leave a comment telling me what moment in Julia's story hit you hardest. Was it the empty chair at Christmas? The discovery of her grandmother's real will? The moment she set boundaries with her mother? The final monologue about roots growing from broken ground? I read every comment, and your insights often teach me things about these stories that I didn't see when I was writing them. You bring your own experiences to these narratives, and that creates meaning I never could have anticipated. And if you're currently in a situation like Julia's, if you're the one sitting at the kids' table or being cropped out of family photos or working yourself to exhaustion, trying to prove you're worthy of love, I want you to know something. You already are worthy. Right now, exactly as you are worthy. You don't need anyone's permission to know your own value. You don't owe toxic people endless chances to hurt you. You're allowed to choose yourself, to protect your peace, to build a life that doesn't require their validation. It won't be easy. Julia's path wasn't easy, but it led her somewhere worth going, and yours can too. Thank you again for being here, for listening, for engaging with stories that matter. Until next time, remember that you're stronger than you know, you can survive any storm, and you are always forever enough.